Welcome back. Welcome to Chapter 4, Emotional and Personality Development in Infancy. Today we're going to be looking at a whole bunch of ideas around this fact of the evolving emotional life of the child, right? And how these social pressures and these new situational influences start to interplay with the genetic makeup of the young human and start to form what we are going to later call personality. And as we start to move towards this development of a psychologically unique human being, and how infancy plays this key role in this beginning stage of interaction between the child and the social world. Boom. Welcome back. Hope that this is decent and enjoyable and that you're doing okay. And, grab a coffee, pull up a chair, and let's get into it. Cheers. I love teaching to you all. All right, next slide. An interesting place to kind of start with this discussion is that we see emotions almost immediately, right? Like especially it's at a certain point it's hard to tell, like a crying baby right in the delivery room, is that an emotional reaction or is that just a core reaction. But we start to see that these emotions, an infant starts developing these really early in life. So I have some notes here, so I'll just kind of go back between kind of freewheeling and reading from some notes here. But maybe I'll put up the slide here for you. So, and you don't have to write anything down here, but I just wanted to make this point that we start to see this spectrum of emotional development really young, really early. Emotions that infants express in the first 6 months of life include things like surprise and interest and joy and anger and sadness and fear and disgust, right? So we're seeing this range of both what we would call kind of positive and negative emotionality. So things positive emotionality like joy and positive surprise, and negative emotionality things like fear and early signs of what we would later call like anxiety or what we're going to call today inhibition. And we're going to talk about that specifically. There's a debate about when emotions such as jealousy, empathy, embarrassment, pride, shame, guilt, things like that appear. These later developing emotions have been called self-conscious or other conscious emotions because they involve the reactions of others. So now think about that for a sec. That's kind of an interesting, cool first big point for today's lecture, is that there seems to be these two types of levels of emotion, and we sort of already know that. Because, right, if you think about like what jealousy is, that's at an emotional level. But it demands a different kind of cognitive engagement with your world. You have to know what you're jealous of. You have to be able to scale yourself in relation to other people. It's an other people focused emotion. And it seems like those other people focused emotions come later. That's kind of neat, eh? These later developing emotions, I'm just going to say this again, have been called self-conscious or other conscious emotions because they involve emotional reactions of other people. And if you're interested and want to go more into that, which would be something that if you're really into early childhood and you're wanting to go down that path more long term, looking into this early development of emotions might be really interesting to you. The studies by a guy named Lewis, just exactly how it sounds, like Lewis, and from 2015. If you just put Lewis 2015 self-conscious emotions, you'd find something. Most experts argue that the so-called self-conscious emotions don't occur until after the first year, a view that is increasingly shared by most developmental psychologists. So this is directly from the textbook. Indeed, the structural immaturity of the infant brain makes it unlikely that emotions that require thought, I put in quotes, can be experienced in the first year. Now, I put the quotes on thought. That was a quote from the textbook. So it depends on what you mean by thought. Right? And we're saying that infants are sensory motor. So at a certain level, that's pre-thought, right? And this is kind of a Piaget idea. Like, what does sensory motor mean? It means that, like, this is one of these things everybody's heard, sensory motor, oh, this is one of like the stages, blah, blah, blah. It's like, it means like the senses, it means like motor means movement. We all know that, move on. It's like, well, no, it's actually way deeper than that. It means that their whole perceptual experience of the world is being channeled through the sense organs and through their movement, and there's not this perceptual filter yet. There's not this thought. It's a more direct experience. I'll read that sentence again. Indeed, the structural immaturity of the infant brain makes it unlikely that emotions that require thought can be experienced in the first year of life. And again, I'm just challenging that sentence by it all comes down to what you mean by thought. If you mean just cognitive activity, an infant's engaging in an incredible amount of cognitive activity. If you're talking about logical thinking, they're not at that stage yet. Their thinking is closer to what we would consider a dream. Now, I may have said this before, so please forgive me if I'm being repetitive, but we dreamt long before we talked as human beings. And the language of dreams is an older, symbolic, abstract, pre-conscious type of thought that is probably more close to what a early child's thought is like. Now, again, we're getting into some deep water on the very first slide or whatever, but I think my feeling of your group is that you like the deep waters because that's where a lot of the interesting stuff lies in psychology. So I'm not gonna put the brakes on myself just because I'm going a little off note, because I think that adds texture or context, I meant to say. Okay. What I would like you to have down is this definition of emotion. That when we're talking about emotions, we're talking about a feeling, or sometimes you see this word affect, which is like effect, but with an A in front, which means like the felt effect, right? So it's like, if my emotion is sadness, it's like what I feel like when I'm sad is the affect. So a feeling or affect that occurs when a person's in a state or an interaction that's important to them, especially their well-being, that part of, and this is important, that's important to them. Right? And this adds this perceptual element of what emotion is. And we all know that like what would make one of you jealous and wouldn't make the other of you jealous, even in the exact same situation, that we're all different in different ways. Now, that's a question for today. Why? Why wouldn't, if we use like some kind of game theory and we set up situations where we're all in a situation and our significant other is like hit on by someone else, why don't we all respond with the exact same type of response? That's actually a hard question to answer in a psychology class, because you have to move outside of the operating system, you have to move outside of the hardware, and you have to get to this deeper Freudian almost level of, well, what is personality? What do we mean when we say that there's a person and I'm a person that's different than you, and our personality, who we are as persons, as people, is different, and we can actually classify how we're different. And that, but with babies, we don't say that they have personality yet. We have a different word for that we're going to get to today, and I'll just say now, is temperament. That babies aren't actually born with personality, they're born with almost these building blocks of what will become temperament, personality. Again, just maybe refrain from writing about that, because I'm going to get to that in a sec. I'll just read this. For our purposes, we'll define emotion as a feeling or affect that occurs when a person is in a state of interaction, a state or an interaction. So let me just stop and not skim past that. What is a state? I'm just not in the right mind state to write this paper right now. Or, we say things like that. Well, what does that mean? It's kind of this in the moment snapshot of how you're doing psychologically, emotionally, physically, right? That a state is kind of a recognition of this idea that your life's not one continual long scene, that there's different things happening. You're just in better moods sometimes than others, and when you're in different moods, you process things differently. Right? And we call those different, well, the word state kind of implies like your physical state, your emotional state, your cognitive state. It's kind of a word that transcends those natural kind of ways that we break up human experience. And it's kind of saying like, what's the kind of accumulation of all those things right now? What's your current state? If we were to pause, if we were to like say your life's a movie and we were to pause right now and we were to analyze, okay, where does she score in terms of psychological health, in terms of current mood, in terms of current physical biology, health, functioning, right? And we could assess your state. And so sometimes it's helpful to think about things that way. That when we're depressed or stressed out, we're in a depressed, stressed out state. It's this complex interaction between our emotions, our thoughts, and our behaviors, and that sometimes the way out is challenging one of those levels. Going for a walk. Especially in infancy, emotions have an important role in communicating with others and in the behavioral organization of us. Right? So think about that. That one of the big things emotion does, and I'd like you to have this in your notes, please. One of the big things emotion does is it regulates behavior. Now, you see that dramatically with a kid. It's like, I have to be careful if my daughter makes like a poo joke or something, which kids do. It's like, and I laugh. It's like, okay, now that's my fault now, because now I'm going to hear that same joke 9 million times, just different variations. Lulu, skip to my poo. She's just like every song you can think of. My daughter's like an expert. She's 4 years old. She's like a Weird Al Yankovic. She's like an expert at like turning normal songs into songs about poo, and it's like, it's kind of funny, but it's because she's the caregiver's emotion or whatever. It's like the fact, we're going to talk about this later, is social referencing, but that's a term we'll get to. But it's just this idea of like how what she sees as funny is heavily influenced by what she thinks I think is funny. Not everybody, me, right? Because I'm talking about my own daughter, right? So a lot of her emotion is, again, we were using this idea of like other conscious, or like it exists in recognition of how I think about something. And so see how this is starting to be the social shaping of the young human. Through emotions, infants communicate such important aspects of their lives as joy, sadness, interest, fear. In terms of behavioral organization, emotions influence infants' social responses and adaptive behaviors as they interact with the world. A lot of their emotional experiences is teaching them what is expected of them. Yeah, it's very interesting. And then I don't know why I have this on this slide, because I actually made this point on the last slide about how self-conscious emotions don't seem to come until after the first year. But, if there's a point worth repeating, it's that one. It's pretty interesting that we don't actually see this emotional self-awareness until the end of the first year. Okay, I already made that point, but just it's kind of mind-blowing, right? So like, what are emotions of, just to go over that one last time, it's like things like jealousy, empathy, being embarrassed, feeling pride, feeling shame, feeling guilt. So all those start to come in the second year. Now think about that. Think of how much of, even if you're a 25-year-old, how much of your how much do we all, not you, how much do we all struggle with things like jealousy and empathy and embarrassment or pride or shame or guilt, or just basically, those all could just be basically classified as like caring about others' views of us. And, it's not just that, but it's other focused. It's self-conscious. And to be self-conscious, you have to be aware that there's things that aren't yourself, that there's other people. I don't know. I noticed that I'm getting more ranty with this class, but I think I'm just getting a bit more comfortable, and I'm getting a little bit more comfortable with recording the video. I don't know if it adds anything for you or if it's distracting, but if you could let me know, that'd be cool, because I don't know I can't do anything about the bald head, but I don't know, it feels a tiny bit more personal for me, even though I can't see you. But okay, I'm gonna keep going. Enough with that. Next slide. So I want to kind of use this beginning part to talk about 3 things that are coming up in terms of kind of biological and environmental influences on kids. And I want to look at 3 kind of specific things that I think you'll find interesting: smiling, crying, and expressions of fear. Right, so crying, smiling, and fear. But before we get into this, before we get into some of the biological environmental influences on it, I wanted to make this point around the origins of what even relationship is. What does that even mean? We all have these complicated, subjective, personal worlds. What's it mean to try to share that with someone else? To be in relation with someone, to be in a ship, going the same direction of relation. It's like this idea of this intense bond between infant and caregivers. And that we have to understand that, I think I said this in a class the other time, but that things co-evolve. Right? So how parents interact with babies and how babies interact with parents evolved in the same world, and those processes would have evolved together. We call that co-evolved. Right? It's not like the female reproductive system evolved and then how babies evolve in response. Like, it's like those two things develop together, evolve together. Coevolution is an important idea. But this idea of like this deep synchronicity in this early relationship, and that this early relationship matters because it's establishing the idea of what relationship even is in the child's mind. It's the origin of relationship. And that's why it has a disproportional effect on shaping emotional and relational patterns moving forward. This emotional bond between infant and their caregiver emerges through these coordinated interactions, these two-sided interactions. That these interactions between parents and infants are sometimes described as reciprocal, meaning back and forth. Right? Or synchronous, or like that the level of synchronicity is an important factor. Like, is when baby cries because it needs to be fed, is it fed? Right? Or does mom try to coddle the baby because she's thinks that it's upset, but really it's hungry? And it's like, we're going to talk about that in a bit, but like, what's the level of sync between mom and baby, or caregiver and baby in some situations? Right? So it's a dynamic, complicated, might be the most complicated relationship there is. Because it's the origin relationship mind. And this happens for each individual baby that's ever been born. They have a first relationship that becomes Piaget would use the term later, like becomes like a model of what relationship even is. And you can understand that, say you're 25 and you had like your first relationship maybe in high school. And then you could maybe understand if I made a point that like sometimes if you have a first relationship, maybe it doesn't end the greatest and it like affects how you approach the next one. It's like, now amplify that big time. And it's like that same affect the next relationship idea is what I'm saying here with this origins. It's actually the foundational base of our understanding of relationship for the rest of our lives. And we're going to talk about later this idea of attachment and how attachment has these long-reaching influences, because attachment is talking about this original origin relationship, right? And it's not maybe surprising that the word original and origin is basically the same word, just a different ending. All right, Nipissing. I love Nipissing. To me, Nipissing is you like 68 people or whatever. It's like, I've never even been to North Bay, but I would love to go. I think I love the North. I'm a big, this is a side rant, but I'm a big like Algonquin Park. Like, I like going up to the Perry Sound area, camping, stuff like that. So I feel like I would love North Bay. I have a lot of ties to Kitchener, but anyways, just shouting you out. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I want to talk about this from a few different perspectives, but this idea of like how biology affects things, because it affects things in really interesting ways. Right? For example, a kid that's born blind, a kid that's born blind may have never seen someone else's face, but will still smile and frown. So when they're happy, they'll still smile. What? So if everything's just learned behavioral copying, why would that be the case? Right? Why would the baby be smiling? It's it's an argument for this idea that it's like hardwired genetically, that there's a genetic component to that it's not just based on visual cues. Children blind from birth, or let me just read it here. I have it just written a little nicer in these notes. Emotions are influenced by biological foundations and then by a person's experience. So this is the nature-nurture, right? Biological foundations, experience, nature, nurture. Genetics, parenting. Emotions are influenced by, I'll say this again. Emotions are influenced by biological foundations and by a person's experience. Two lines of evidence reveal the importance of biological foundations. First, children that are born blind from birth and have never observed a smile or a frown from another person's face nonetheless smile and frown in the same way that children with normal vision do. So that's like things that make you go, And then the second point, that facial expressions of basic emotions, things like happiness, surprise, anger, fear, are very similar across cultures. So different cultures obviously around the world. So say if we were to compare like people in Central Asia to people in South America, it's like there'd be differences obviously, but at like a core emotional expression level, there'd be a lot of similarities to how if you were to find a child and give them like some surprising multicolored present, the surprise would look relatively the same. And that's interesting. That's evidence for there being a genetic, that it's not just learned, right? Because if it's just learned, then we'd expect if you were in very different learning environments, there'd be very different outcomes. But if there's consistency, that speaks to a genetic determinism aspect, right? Obviously, it's just a piece of it, right? It's almost never going to be nature or nurture. It's this difficult to get our head around combo. Nonetheless, though, infants' emotions are influenced by both the momentary and stable characteristics of parents. So now, before I talk about that for a sec, like this is saying like, even though all the rules around things like how to express emotions and when it's appropriate and all that stuff is different by cultures, it's interesting that there's still this similarity. Right, but then that last point that I made is somewhat a rough one, right? It's like if you're a parent, it's a rough one to think about, like your emotions affect your kid, and that's both your long-term, like your stable characteristics, but also your momentary characteristics. So even if it's not the norm for you. So again, it's not like any parent has ever been emotionally perfect, but it's something to keep in mind. All right. Next slide. Yeah, this is a tough one for me. My daughter, oh my goodness, would she cry when she was first born? She had this, I think the term we're going to use today is like a distress cry, but she had this cry where she would just like, and anytime she'd breathe in like that, you'd just be like, oh God, you'd have to like cover your ear because she's just going to be like, wow, and just she would cry so loud. She cried so loud. This story is like kind of funny, but it was brutal at the time. It's like she cried so loud. We were camping in Nova Scotia once, and she woke up in like the middle of the night and it was really dark and she was really scared. She was like maybe 1 at the time, maybe like 14 months or like just a bit more than 1-year-old. And she cried so much that night. I was like trying to walk around with her. Eventually I got her in the car and I just like drove around the campsite for hours. But she cried so much that night when we woke up in the morning, like the people in the campsites all around had all left. It was like that bad. And so like I did so much research on crying because I was like, man, this is making me nuts. Because like she would cry so loud that it would ring my ear and I would like almost have like a stress reaction. And any parents out there maybe know what I'm talking about. But so I struggled with it, and it made me really look into crying at a different level. Like I've taught about crying and that it has this evolutionary role and all this stuff, but then you really realize it. It's like, well, you come to this really important realization where If my daughter's crying wasn't annoying, I'd be less likely to get up and do something about it. And so think about it like this. It's like, say if a baby's crying was really smooth and rhythmic and not that loud, it wouldn't achieve its goal. That being able for mom to hear, in most evolutionary senses, is one of the most important things for the baby being able to survive. And so actually having an annoying, piercing cry is an evolutionary benefit. And now let's go even further into the dark water, or the deep waters of, sometimes dark waters of evolutionary past, where it's like, we know now that the female ear, the mother's ear, can hear her own baby crying at a level that a human ear shouldn't be able to hear. So not only is the crying an irritant, it's an irritant that the mother can pick up and will respond to at a level below normal range. That's almost borderline magical. That's incredible. Crying is, oh, let me put these points up, sorry. Crying is the most important mechanism newborns have for communicating with their world. Cries may also provide information about the health of a newborn's central nervous system. Right? So it's like, it's seen as a sign of health. You'd be nervous if a baby wasn't crying. Now, again, take this with a grain of salt, because there's a wide spectrum of what we would consider healthy. Right? So some babies are very low in affect, so that they don't cry much at all, and some cry all the time, and both can be very healthy. So just don't read too much into that. But that it actually is connected with, like, that they're responding to their external world, which basically means your central nervous system is working. Your central nervous system, think about what it is. It's your nerves. It's the centralization of your nerves. It's what is basically your part of your body that's responding to the world. It's what makes you be aware of yourself, a centralized nervous system. Newborns even tend to respond with cries and negative facial expression when they hear other newborns cry. Although crying is universal, a study by Jones in 2012 revealed that newborns of depressed mothers showed less focal distress when another infant cried, reflecting the emotional and psychological dysregulation. Now, here's something about depressed mothers that I need to make clear. This is a very complex topic, and it has to do also with things like postpartum. It's not the mother being depressed that has an effect on the baby. It's that when a mother's depressed, they tend to interact less with the baby. The interacting less with the baby causes the negative influence. If you're a mother ever yourself and are experiencing depression, what you need to know is you need to interact with the baby more than you feel like you need to. And if you do that, you can counteract almost all of that negative effect. The negative effect's not coming from the depression. The negative effect is coming from the effect of the depression on mom's behavior towards the kid. I just think that's a really, sorry I got intense there, but I just feel like that's an important clarification point. Although crying is universal, a study by Jones in 2012 revealed that newborns of depressed mothers, I said this already, showed less focal distress when another infant cried. So that empathy piece, even for something as basic as crying, then these early experiences really do matter. Most adults can determine whether an infant's cry signifies anger or pain. Parents can distinguish amongst various types of cries of their own baby and whether it's their baby or another. And it's kind of funny because, like, my wife's sister, Wendy, their new baby, Theo, cries in the same way that Evie did years ago, right? My daughter, because my daughter's now 4. So, like, it's this weird thing where if I'm with them and Theo cries, it almost, like, for momentarily, it almost sparks that same, just reaction. Reaction would be the word. Many developmental psychologists recommend that parents soothe the crying infant, especially in the first year. Consistent with Erickson's theory, this idea of the first year being related to establishing trust, responding positively to an infant's cry will help the infant to develop a sense of trust and a secure attachment to their caregiver. Mothers' negative reactions of anger or anxiety to crying increase the risk of subsequent or later on attachment issues. And if you're interested in that, This is from a study by someone named Lerkes, which is Leerkes, 2011. Problems in infant sootheability, so how much like an infant that's crying is able to be calmed. Problems in infant sootheability at 6 months of age have been linked to insecure attachments at 12 months, so 6 months later, proving more evidence that these early emotional responses matter. In other words, responding positively to an infant's cry teaches the infant that the world is a safe and trustworthy place, which is exactly what Erikson said. Right? That it's, do you trust this world, or is this world full of threats? Trust versus mistrust, Erikson's very first developmental stage. Right, so it's all tied in with this. We're just talking about, well, what even is trust? Well, to even have trust, you have to understand what are you trusting? Are you trusting the world? Are you trusting other people at a relational level? Right, so you see how there's these layers of complexity, because we're still talking about this. I'm resisting just saying dream mind of the child, because you're not going to find that in the literature. That's kind of just my way of saying it, but it's like a usefully wrong way of looking at it, maybe is a way to say it. All right, because they're not dreaming. They're not dreaming when they're awake, but that type of unrestricted free flow, abstract, constructive, less rule governed, I don't know how else to say, dreamlike style of thought. Okay. If to add some balance, if every crying was one of the hard parts of when she was really little, like her first smiles more than overcompensated. It was like overcorrected. I mean, it's like that was like one of my favorite things in the world. It's like she just all of a sudden, and I remember this is common for dads, that like a couple months in, it's like at first it doesn't seem like Evie wanted anything to do with me. It was just, I basically was just the person that carried her over to mom, and then all of a sudden she started like interacting more with me through facial expressions, through smiling, and it was like a whole different level of relationship. You like fall in love with the kid. It's like that you start to learn that this smiling is actually this critical, you can look at it as both a social skill and as a signaling mechanism. It tells people things, right? If I run into you at the mall and I'm like, oh, nice to see you, it's great to see you, it's like you can read tons into how I think about you by that. Right now, you could I could also obviously be faking and stuff, but that's more of like an adult kind of thing. It's like at this young level, it's showing that there's these like, there's a part of it that's behavioral way of interacting at this emotional level of their social world, and that we see these two types of smiling in infants, right? We see these reflexive smiles. Now, these are kind of interesting. Reflexive, so that word usually means basically the same thing as a reflection, like if you reflect on something. But a reflexive, if I was like, okay, this class today went pretty good, I want you to take like it just doesn't make sense because it's not live, but I want you to take a reflexive look at how you maybe played into that situation, and maybe you were like really listening well and asked good questions and were like participating, and like, so reflexive is like reflecting on it, but your role in it. So it's like they think that a lot of babies early smiling when they're sleeping in this first month or so, it's like them like kind of just thinking about their world. It's like it's not smiling about something out there. Again, the link to dreams is, I think, not stated but clear. And then this other piece that obviously smiling has this huge social component, and that we see this as early as 2 months. Baby starting to like, I shouldn't have done that. Now that I saw myself do that, and maybe I won't do that in class anymore because I look silly, but it's like that kind of goo goo gaga kind of talking to babies. It's like, because you start to get that interaction, and that interaction is actually building their mind, right? That it's this interaction between almost their programming and their world, and it's like this interplay, this early interplay. In terms of biological and environmental influences on the young infant, one area where it's really interesting is in terms of the emotional expression of fear, and that fear seems to be one of the earliest emotions. And if you look at how relevant fear and how that's related to obviously detecting threats or situations where there's a lack of trust, how core that would be to evolutionary success or survival success. It's one of the earliest emotions we see. We see it at 6 months. We see it peaking by a year and a half. Okay, we see that this is a tough point, difficult, very difficult situations, but we see that this fear can be shaped dramatically by experience, and that especially in, like the text was talking about, some tough to talk about brutal situations where there's a lot of abuse and neglect, and infants can show fear as early as 3 months. So again, that's a depressing point. The most frequent expression of this fear is something called stranger anxiety, and I'm going to talk about that more on the next slide, right? Or basically just this fear of other people, right? Who's a stranger? Just anyone that's not in that familiar idea of who they've created a relationship model for. We see this emerging at 6 months, just this idea of like I feel safe with these people feel like strangers. And that by 9 months, this stranger anxiety intensifies, becomes more intense, and escalates through to about year 1. Now, through this course, I'm talking a lot about evolution and evolutionary influences. So you can probably see how this idea of being fearful of people that aren't mom, basically, or aren't the primary caregiver, is related to survival, is related to staying safe. And actually priming and linking on to mom is a key survival aspect for almost all mammals, at least. Right? But also birds and stuff like that too. So it's not limited to mammals. So just continuing from the last slide, I wanted to keep going on this idea that like stranger anxiety usually emerges rather gradually. I'll put a few kind of short form points of what I'm talking about up, just in case you're copying down with the slide for my students. That this stranger anxiety usually emerges rather gradually, right? So it's something that develops. So what that means, it tends to appear, as I said in the last slide, around 6 months. By 9 months, fear of strangers becomes more intense. And as we just talked about, it kind of intensifies and escalates until the first birthday. Situational factors play a role. Now I have that as just like a standalone sentence. It's like, you might want to have that in your notes. I have that, I don't know why I don't have it on the screen, but it's in this note. It's like, obviously situational factors play a role, like how the child's been parented plays a big role. And also just what is happening in the current situation. So this fact of like a child so when Evie was little, if she was like sitting on my lap, she'd be much more tolerant to other people than if she was like in the middle of the room with people she didn't know, right? So it's like that picture on the screen, it looks like a daughter maybe holding their mom's leg. It's like, that's exactly what Evie would do to me all the time. And if I was to say, if we were doing this class live, even though she's 4 years old, if we were doing this class live and all of a sudden she just found herself in the middle of the class, she'd probably run up to me and grab my leg. Just like that. Why? Because, and in a lot of ways that's a good thing, because it's a safe home base. Infants show less stranger anxiety when they're in a familiar setting. For example, in one study, 10-month-olds, because I did it with a bunch of kids, showed little stranger anxiety when they met a stranger in their own home, but much greater fear when they encountered that stranger or a different stranger in a research lab. Right? So like, basically that's saying like even within the same kid in the same time period, the experience is different depending on like, is it in a familiar setting? Or are you seeing this stranger also in a strange situation? Infants also showed less stranger anxiety when sitting on their mother's lap than when their mother was several feet away. Right, so there's situational contexts affecting stranger anxiety. It's fascinating to think about really deeply, like how this roots to or links to anxiety more generally. And this is like this, how this initial safe space, or not safe space, that's not the word I mean, a home base emotionally, the long-term effects it has and the long-term role it plays is just so dynamic. Right, that who the stranger is and how they're behaving influences the anxiety of the infant. Right, even secure infants, and we'll talk about what secure means in a second, what secure and insecure and the different types of attachments are. But even kids that we would score high on this and say that they had secure attachments, they still show this. Right, and it's actually a sign of developing intelligence, because they're recognizing, like, I don't know this person, I'm wary of this person, and their behavior is being shaped by this emotional experience of anxiety, emotional, cognitive, physical. Right, so it's interesting to see how this is our first exposure to this very common emotion of anxiety or unrest. I kind of referenced this earlier when I said this idea of like my daughter and all of her poo jokes. It's like once I laugh, it's like, oh no, I laughed at that. Now I'm gonna hear this all day. And it's like, because her reference is like, did I laugh or not? If I laughed, it's funny. If I didn't laugh, it's not funny. The social world is the reference point to determine her felt emotion. Right? This is what's called social referencing. So I'll just put up, again, I'll just kind of put up the short form points for the people writing notes, and then I'll kind of just explain it and rant and everything. So infants not only express emotions like fear, but they also read the emotions of other people. Okay, and if you want to see a really interesting study on this, Cornu, it's just spelled C-O-R-N, like corn, E-W at the end, so Cornu, a study from 2012. Social referencing involves reading the emotional cues in others to help us determine how to act in certain situations, or I should just said in a particular situation. So we read the cues of other people, and now it's saying like for an infant, this is what they're doing all the time. Should I be afraid of this? It's like why they say like if a kid falls, you shouldn't be like, oh my god, and like treat it like a huge crisis, because then they're gonna see you acting like that and think that it's right. Whereas if you're like, oh, you handled that fall perfect. I only thought that like lions could land that great, or like, you like instantly distract them, and then it's like they didn't take the cue from you to react as if it's an emergency. The development of social referencing helps infants interpret ambiguous, so hard to read situations more accurately, as an example is like when they encounter a stranger. By the end of the first year, a patient's facial expressions, whether they're smiling or whether they look scared, influence whether an infant will explore an unfamiliar environment. Right, so if I'm walking with my daughter and I'm like, and I look down an alleyway, it's like that will obviously affect her behavior, right? But maybe saying that's not super groundbreaking, but then my question to you is why? Well, because she's letting what she thinks my interpretation of the situation is affect hers. She's social referencing her emotions. Infants become better at social referencing in the second year of life. At this age, they tend to check whether their caregivers, they tend to check with their caregivers almost before reactions. Like there'll be something on the movie, and she'll like look at me, and if I'm smiling, then she'll smile. It's almost like they're looking for that validation from the social world. They're referencing to the social world. They look at their caregivers to see if they're happy or angry or fearful. Whether an infant attempts to climb upstairs or approach a new toy can depend in part by signals received from the caregiver. Right, so it's this social referencing is affecting the child's early behaviors. So that's what social referencing, just this idea of like determining how you feel based on how you think other people are responding. Oh, everybody else is panicking, I should panic. Now the flip is one of the aspects of being a mature human adult is learning how to resist the very natural tendency to social reference. everyone else is taking this as a huge deal and everyone else is treating this as the end of the world, I should too. It's like, well, maybe you shouldn't though. Right? All right, I'll stop on that point. Next slide. So at a certain point we get to this discussion of like how are kids even different, and I kind of got on a little rant around this earlier about what even do we mean with this word personality? What does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to say that people are different? Are you talking like cognitively or neurologically? Are you talking like emotionally? Because we all have basically the same threat detection and emotional discharge system. We basically have the same physical bodies, like with minor variations. We have basically the same cognitive functionality with minor variations. What's it mean to say that we have different personalities? And where does that come from? And this is going to be what we're talking about now. Right? This idea of what even is personality and how is it conceptualized as something that's this response to the interaction between our genetic makeup and the parenting situation we're born into. And that personality is something that emerges through this dynamic interaction between our temperament, what we're born with, which I'm going to talk about in a sec, and our environment, which is basically mainly our parents at this age. So I've brought up this word personality a bunch of times today without giving any kind of definition. So I wanted to just put this up for a second, make this clear comment that within the developmental research, we wouldn't really say that a child's born with personality. Now that's sort of misleading because it's not that they're born blank slate in like a Lockean sense. It's like in a John Locke kind of blank slate tabula rasa, which you've probably heard of that idea. It's not that. So there's something to be said about that idea. Like there's definitely children are highly moldable through experience and parenting and stuff like that. But to say that they're complete blank slates, we just genetically know that that's just not true. That babies aren't born with personalities necessarily. They're born with these temperaments. That just means that they're just different, right? And they're different in how, for example, how much activity level they have. And I'm going to give you 5 things that kind of 5 measures of temperament. They're different in like how shy they are, or how like much negative emotion they show. They're different in how active they are. They're different in how much attention span they have. You don't have to write this down. I'm going to give you a list in a sec, but I'm just showing these are what we mean by these predispositions, meaning like they're more likely to be active. This kid's less active. It's like we wouldn't really say that they have a more or less active personality. We would call that a temperament. Right? So that kind of has the word temper in it, but temperament means kind of like what's your base emotional behavioral tendencies. Right? And that this temperament that we're born with interacts with our environment, and this interaction with the environment leads to what we later call personality. So we have this personality, or I've said this word now on this slide about 10 times, but what we really mean by personality is this idea that you're not just a random person. You don't just go to a party and then go to work and then go to your family event and then go to church or something. And it's not like you might act differently because of different situational pressures and relationships, but you're the same person. You have certain patterns of how you behave and how you interact with people and what you do, and even at like a personal behavioral pattern that we would call habits. You're your own person. You're your own person in your patterns of thinking, in your patterns of emotion, in your patterns of spirituality, right? And so what I'm basically saying is temperament is what you're born with, and then that interacts with your environment, which is largely just your parenting and your family environment, and that the interaction of those things is what constructs personality. So again, this is another nature plus nurture, not nature or nurture. It's this, and not even plus, it's like this super complex dynamic interaction between the two. That temperament and what becomes what we consider ourself, but that goes through this pressure cooker that we call childhood or parenting or all this stuff, right? And that temperament becomes personality down the road through its engagement with the environment. So one kind of oversimplified way, but one way that people talk about this is in terms of temperament. Well, you'll hear people say things like, I'll just put this up. You hear people say, oh, I had a really easy child or a slow to warm child. This is actually language that comes from work by a person named Chess and Thomas, two researchers, and how they classified, right? So classifying just means that we could score kids differently on this. And based on those scores, we could put them into classification groups. Temperament refers to these individual differences in behavior styles, in how they, not just behavior styles, but also emotional styles and characteristic ways of responding, right? So it's like kids are different. Think about those three things because those are huge. Kids are different in how they behave, like activity level stuff. They're different in how they express emotion, and they're different in their ways of responding to things. With regard to the link to emotion, temperament refers to individual differences in how quickly emotion is shown, how strong it's shown, how long it lasts, how quickly it fades. In their longitudinal investigation, so longitudinal means that the opposite would be, so sometimes a study is like with a group of people and you study them once and you get them to do a survey or something. Longitudinal would be if you followed up with them then a couple years later, and then a couple years later, probably at a standard interval. So longitudinal, you'll notice the word long is in that, and it just means research done over and over again with the same group of subjects over a long period of time. So that's why longitudinal research would be interesting here, because what you'd want to do is measure kids when they're really young and then measure them when they're older and see if there's any predictive value. Okay. In their longitudinal investigation, Chess and Thomas found that 40% of children that they studied would be classified as easy, 10% as difficult, and 15% as slow to warm. 15. So 40% easy, 10% difficult, 15% slow to warm. You'll notice that doesn't equal 100. Notice that 35% didn't fit one of these three patterns. Researchers have found that the three basic clusters of temperament are moderately stable across childhood. So that's interesting. It's like the kid scores on these. It's not completely predictive of how they'll be throughout childhood, but it's moderately stable, meaning it's pretty consistent. Right? So, because again, if it was like, if we measured kids and then we measured them again a couple months later and they were completely different, it was like the value of that first measurement is almost nothing. But if you can measure them here and then you measure them years later, and your initial measurements helped you understand how they were here, then we'd be like, okay, that has some explanatory or predictive value. So now let's just break down this idea of temperament, right? These dimensions, right? So remember, dimensions just means a part of something that is so core to his existence that these five things kind of exist together and they're all the same thing. So temperament is really five things. It's these five dimensions. The first dimension is activity level. So you could think of this as we could make a scorecard from 0 to 100 and give us a child a score 0 to 100 on all five of these things. Then we could somehow tabulate that and we could give them a classification. Okay, so we could score this. This is a measurement attempt. All right, so we're saying one of the things we could score is how active they are. The kids are just different in how much they run around and how much they're, well, if we're talking about an infant, maybe it's not running around, but just how much they're looking around, how much they're grabbing things, how much they're being active. This tendency to move often and vigorously rather than to remain passive or immobile. Immobile, like not moving. Right, so it's like, okay, so then we give the kid, maybe the kid gets like a 72 compared to other kids. This is all comparative. So 72 would mean like, if there was 100 kids, you'd score about 72 in terms of maybe 100 is like the most active and 0 is the least active. All right, then we could give them a score on positive emotionality. So like if all of a sudden you put a new toy in the middle of the room, how likely are they to approach that with like a positive kind of curiousness? Right, so positive emotionality is kind of the opposite of being like scared, right? Moving towards, that's why they call it approach. Right, moving, you can see how moving towards and approach means the same thing, sort of, rather than away from a new experience, usually accompanied by some kind of positive emotion like curiosity or interest. Okay, so now we have the first 2 of 5. So we could give someone a score on activity level, and we could give someone a score on approach emotionality, or what's often called positive emotion. Emotionality just means the expression of the emotion. So then when we're looking at this, so now I gave you activity level and approach emotionality. So then 3, level of inhibition, right? So how much like kind of nervousness. We see this as actually at the last point there. This is a precursor of shyness. So we wouldn't say that babies are shy, right? We would say that a baby scores high in inhibition, right? So on this scale, inhibition maybe is 100. Or, if we made a kid that's like afraid of everything, we can make it 100 or 0 at a certain point. How we're scaling this is, it's all relative scale anyways. But somebody that would score with a lot of inhibition would be somebody that would be like really nervous, or what we would in an adult call shy. It's the flip side of approach, and it's a tendency to respond with fear or withdrawal in new situations. A precursor to shyness, meaning it seems to be what comes before. Number 4, negative emotionality, right? So this is this idea of like kids are different in how much they cry and fuss and are agitated and are loud. And if there's anyone in this class that maybe has multiple kids, you'll know that your kids are different this way, right? So a negative emotionality is probably the easiest one to explain. And then the last one, which you could call what's called effortful control and task persistence. You could also just kind of call attention span. Like kids are different in how long they can kind of stick to one task. My daughter has always been really good with this. Like, I don't know if it's because she's still a only child right now. It's like, is it that she's played a lot by herself and she's just like, she can play for a long time? Whereas some kids, it's like you give them something to do and it's like 2 minutes later they're like, okay, we're done, what can we do next? And it's like constantly trying to keep them busy. And it's like the kids are different that way, so they would score different on that too. So you'd have different scores on all 5 of those dimensions, and the idea is that's how kids are different, and then that interacts with parenting, and then that kind of is influenced with the development of what we would call personality, which we can then break into the kind of the big 5, and we'll do that later in the course, right? And I actually want to make in the moment note to make sure maybe in the second part of the course in the winter, I want to get more into this big 5 thing and actually doing sorry, I shouldn't be doing this while I'm recording, but I don't want to forget this point, to do some self-assessments with you and get you to like actually score yourself on the scale and see where you fit and how that can inform things like maybe issues that you're having in relationships or with work or with whatever, right? Because basically the idea is that personality is complex. It can be broken into divisions, but really we're only talking about a certain few things, right? Big 5 means you can kind of scale down, and if you ask them about if you ask people about all kinds of different things related to personality, you realize that you can actually group answers, and that you can group answers because really we're only talking about like, well, 5 big personality traits that if you know what the people score on these, you can actually predict their scores on all other kinds of things, and that's why that's such a powerful test. And yeah, we'll talk about big 5 later, but this, because it comes later. At this point, we're still at the stage where we're talking kind of about raw materials, what the baby's born with, and then this temperament interacts with the environment. I know I've said that a bunch of times, but it's like kind of the key point for right now. So this is kind of interesting. This is looking at the origins of where this temperament comes from, and it seems quite interesting that when you look at twin studies, twins that are identical compared to twins that are fraternal, so like depending on if they come from the same egg or not, identical twins are more alike in temperament. So the twins that are closer genetically are more close temperament-wise, which would be an argument for the genetic, or at least for a partial genetic component to this. Adult personality studies also support this idea of an innate temperament, right? So there's a lot of experimental evidence that kind of makes this idea that it does seem like temperament is something that has a genetic origin, is how I would say it. But then there's also this interesting aspect of like the second point there. It's like, okay, but you can't deny the neurological processes. So we know, for example, that somebody that's shy processes their social world differently. They're more likely to have a different threshold for arousal. So what that means is, like, say I get nervous, say I've been doing a lot of public speaking, so say talking in front of one person doesn't make me nervous. 10 people doesn't make me nervous. Maybe 100 people doesn't make me that nervous. 1,000 people, I'd be super nervous. 10,000 people, I'd be crazy nervous. Maybe you reached that threshold at 10 people, but we'd still be the same nervous. Just how we got to that nervous, our threshold when we met that nervousness was different. So the different arousal thresholds, right? So it's like we actually see something like shyness is actually really complex because we see this existing at multiple levels. We can see that actually they're responding as stressed earlier. We're also seeing issues with the dopamine and serotonin, meaning that there's a biochemical component. And also you can actually see shyness in the brain. It actually affects symmetry of the lobes. So what I mean by that is there's like a brain anatomy component too. So it's one of these, it's super complex. But we see that there's these building blocks of what maybe will be a certain type of behavior like shyness later in life. So again, it's just talking about how complex you are as a human being. So now we're at the hour mark. If you want to grab a coffee or something, I'm going to keep going. But if you want to, there's some talk I heard around Nipsing about like cutting these into smaller videos, but it's like, I don't know if I need to do that. You all know how to pause. It's like if you need to take a break, just take a break at any time. I'll just make it at one continuous video unless you really want me to not. It's just from a production side, it's just makes so much more sense to do one long file. But I think that you can handle it. You guys understand YouTube probably better than I do. But yeah, so we're rounding around an hour. This would be a good time to take a little stretch break. I might do that myself, grab another coffee, be back to keep going on how this early childhood temperament transforms into personality and how this is really the building blocks of the mind and who you think you are. And this is kind of starting here. I like this class. I hope you enjoy this. Again, I made this point last time. I'm just going to teach this class as best as I can. Try to be as interesting as I can. Try to just focus on being myself. And I've always been an in-person teacher, but I think I'm getting a little more comfortable talking into this mic. So without further ado, take a quick break. See you next slide. And if you don't take a break, I'll see you in about 2 seconds. And then we can add an even additional level of complexity to this when we look at this idea of how, like, okay, so say somebody's born kind of shy, but then because they're shy, they might, and you can imagine this even as an adult, it's like if you're shy and you don't feel confident socially, maybe you stay away from those situations. And maybe you find roles for yourself to be successful in whatever way in your own life in ways that doesn't demand that. And you almost find your own niche, your own role that allows you a match with your personality. And so this is where it's like, so I have this as the third one, right? If I said like heredity, obviously in twin studies, we see this example that some of the differences in temperament is about heredity, or basically what we get genetically from our ancestors. And then the second one is neurological. So we see that actually how a shy person's brain is engaging stress and arousal is actually different. And then the third one, so that's basically saying it's partly genetic, it's partly a cognitive functioning issue, and then it's also partially a brain anatomy issue. We talked about frontal lobe symmetry, and then it's also environment related, right? That actually people have active choices that they make, and people choose situations that they like more, right? And so you get this chicken and the egg question, like, are neurological differences a cause or an effect of temperament? Does being shy does avoiding social situations make you shy, or or you being shy make you avoid social situations? And again, it's just this like circular serpent eating its own tail thing where it's like they both are, well, it's just saying like it's just the behavioral and the cognitive component of a process that basically we set ourselves up for situations that we feel more comfortable in. And that shouldn't be shocking to you. If you're a very social person, you'll go out of your way to engage in situations that are social. And if you're not, you'll probably go out of your way to have time by yourself. All Sandra Scar is saying is that she's just calling that niche picking, right? That you're picking the environment that matches your personality. People of all ages choose experiences that reflect their temperaments. right? So like for me, I would feel way more comfortable like with a couple buddies in like a den basement kind of like this, just watching a sports game. I'd feel way more comfortable doing that than being at like a club or something, right? To me, that's almost like just overstimulating. It's like, and again, like now you're hearing me as like a 40-year-old. I'm like, oh, these kids and their loud music. It's like, but at a certain point, it's like those days are kind of done for me. It's like I would rather hang out with a book and you know, a warm tea. It's like it's niche picking, right? Niche is a weird word, but it just means like a good way to explain it that I explain it to people is like just for you a sports team, it's like you can't all play point guard. It's like someone has to be the point guard on a basketball team. Someone has to be, you know, well, small forward, shooting guard, power forward, center. You got to play different roles, right? If everyone plays the same role, it doesn't work. And so this is that. So you could say that is you have to have your own niche on a team. It's like people say that in sports all the time. It's like the person knows their role and how that they can like, maybe this person's not the best shooter. I'll keep with basketball, but maybe they're a really good rebounder. And if they can just play good defense and keep the ball moving on offense and rebound, that they're good. In PJ Tucker, if you're a basketball fan, there's a great example. Plays on Houston Rockets. He can hit his open 3-pointers. He's a great defender. It's like that's enough for him to be important. He doesn't have to deke out people and dribble all over the place and dunk. And so it's like knowing your role, and that people do this all the time whether they're aware of it or not. Right, and then obviously this other situation of like parents also have this huge ability to have an influence on this, right? So, and again, this comes where we get to synchronicity. So like it can be very tough on, say, a kid that has a very low threshold for anxiety, so they get stressed really easy. If they're in a situation where, say, mom is like really on them about everything and really stressed, right? Now, a kid that has a higher tolerance for that, that might actually be good for that kid. So it's like a lot of what's good parenting is situational too, in that sense, right? That there's, and this is where we're going to talk later about this term goodness of fit, or like how much in sync that relationship is almost more important than the specific characteristics of it, because it's so situationally relevant. There was a rant and a half. If you took a break, I just welcomed you back with like a 5-minute rant. But again, I'm getting comfortable. This might be a bad thing for you NIPSing students. It might make a bit longer lectures, but hopefully you're liking this. Okay, anyways, I gotta just stop making those kind of self-reflective comments. But anyways, I love you guys. Let's just keep going. Cheers. So this point around long-term stability is the reason why I think you should care about this, because I mentioned this before, but if we were to like measure this, and then I say it's super meaningful, and then we measure it a month later, and then this kid scores completely different, and there was no predictive effect from the first measurement, we would say like, okay, well then that measure is completely invalid. But because there seems to be this long-term stability, because a measure of a kid early on seems to be predictive of where they'll be later, that gives tremendous value to this notion, right? That these temperamental patterns that we see early in infancy tend to persist or maintain right through childhood, and that researchers have found a considerable consistency in some areas, especially around things like inhibition. So like kids that are showing a lot of inhibition early, there's a strong link to shyness. Right, so some things are kind of like more predictive or suggestive. Suggestive's a better word than predictive, because there's lots of kids that grow up with that would score high in inhibition that learn how to engage differently, so it doesn't develop into like a level of shyness that interferes with the person's ability to function as an adult. Now, people that have really high levels of shyness can, now you're basically talking about like assertiveness training and certain kind of behavioral approaches, because at a certain point, shyness is there's a behavioral and a cognitive component and an emotional component to it. So if you were wanting to get better at that, you'd have to attach that or attack that as a multi-dimensional issue, but people can get better at that. So I don't know, that's just like a kind of a side point. It can get better if that's an area that you struggle with personally. Again, this is kind of one of the limitations of the remote teaching, is I don't know, and maybe once I get into I'm really looking forward to next week. I'm jumping all over, but next week is the student Success Week or whatever that you all had last week. It's next week at Conestoga, so I don't have my classes, my 3 classes with them, so I'm gonna have a good opportunity to do some legwork and catch up on stuff, and I'm super excited to get to those Giants of Psychology assignments that you all are working on and submitting and stuff. I gotta be honest, I forget my segue there, but next slide. So let's look at this idea. So inhibition to the unfamiliar. So think about what that means, this idea of being almost nervous or having inhibition. So like feeling inhibited or held back from doing things that are unfamiliar, and that this is an interesting way of looking at this topic of behavioral inhibition, or that like some kids are more likely to just jump in and do things and be curious and that kind of positive affect, and some kids are more likely to be more reserved and more nervous. So this is from a researcher named Kagan, like Kagan, Kagan's concept of behavioral inhibition. Another way of classifying temperament focuses on the differences between a shy, subdued, timid child and a sociable, extroverted, bold child. Jerome Kagan, so he did this, he had 3 papers, one in 2002, 2010, 2013. So Kagan regards shyness with strangers, so whether that stranger is a peer, so another kid, or an adult, as one feature of a broader temperament category called, this word here, inhibition to the unfamiliar. So this idea of this shyness is, he's saying shyness is like within this within this broader category. Inhibited children react to many aspects of unfamiliar or unfamiliarity with initial avoidance, distress, or subdued or kind of blank affect, like a lack of emotion, beginning around 7 to 9 months. Let me get this up here. In a visit to a lab, inhibited infants do not approach new toys. They stay close to their caregivers, are distressed by a toy robot. Infants that don't score like this play with new toys, leave their caregiver's side easier, although they tend to keep an eye on them. In one study, having an inhibited temperament at 2 to 3 years of age was related to having social phobia symptoms at age 7. Other findings indicate that infants and young children who have inhibited temperaments are at risk of developing social anxiety disorders in adolescence and adulthood. So there seems to be, right, so up here it's like how much, there seems to be some suggestive link. So you see up here how it says like how much control does it take for them to kind of, like how much effort do they have to put towards maintaining their emotional composure, especially when they're in a stress situation, right? Can they self-regulate? So that second point, this idea of self-regulation is like, can they get upset and calm themselves back down? Can they keep arousal from getting too intense? Right, so what you'll see is like when kids are high of effortful control, they can keep the arousal from getting too intense, right? Some of the strategies around self. So for example, I'll just give you a more real example. Say for example, my daughter is kind of on the low effortful control, but trying to get her more high effortful control, and this idea of trying to teach her, control your breathing, take a few deep breaths. I'll rub her back. We think about the beach because that's her favorite place. I might have already said that, but it's like trying to help her. That's called like self-soothing. Learn how to, well, that's actually called just soothing, like me soothing her, but like helping her start to develop the ability to soothe herself so that she can eventually calm herself down. And we would call that self-regulate, regulate herself back to zero. Regulation means like getting back to the regular. It's an important dimension of temperament. See, so this idea that children shouldn't be pigeonholed as having only one temperament dimension. Temperament actually means these bunch of things, and one of them is this inhibition, or what we called like, a lack of approach. where kids are actually different in how much they're made nervous by unfamiliar new situations. And that's not a personality difference, that's a difference in temperament. So I'll let you in on a secret. This is several hours later. So I know I'm going to get this out today. I just got a new coffee. I got a pot of coffee on upstairs. We're doing this all night if need be, you know. Sorry, I wanted to get this out earlier today. Just life kind of happened. I had well, Evie got home and that kind of put an end to that. Now it's 10:30 and I'm getting back at it, but this is coming out today for sure. And at least maybe not literally Friday since I only have another hour and a half, but I'm going to get this recorded tonight and I'll get it going up on YouTube, and I'll have that quiz up in a few days or whatever, but you'll need some time to do it. You have lots of time for the quiz. But back to the lesson at hand. Let's do this. An important point about temperament classification is that children should not be pigeonholed as having only one temperament dimension, such as being difficult or being negative. I kind of said this on the last slide. A good strategy when attempting to classify a child's temperament is to think of temperament as consisting of multiple dimensions. This is from research from a guy named Bates in 2012. For example, a child might be extroverted, show little emotional negativity, and have good self-regulation, whereas another child might be introverted, show little emotional negativity, and have a low level of self-regulation. So they could be like different on all those things. Many researchers argue that children inherent physiological physiology that like a physical physiology is like at the physical level that predisposes them to particular types of temperament. So this is kind of interesting, right? So look at this. I'll put this up on here because this is the point that I want you to write down. So inhibited temperament. So I'll just read this. In particular, an inhibited temperament is associated with unique physiological physical patterns that include a high and stable heart rate. So a heart rate that's high and stable, though, is even more significant because that means it's high and it stays high. Again, I don't know why I took that drink. I should do that between slides. High and stays high, right? High levels of the hormone cortisol. Cortisol is a hormone associated with stress. Right? When you're really stressed, if you were to test your blood, we would predict high levels of the hormone cortisol. So let me just read that sentence again because I got sidetracked saying that about cortisol. In particular, an inhibited temperament is associated with unique physical or physiological pattern that includes a high and stable heart rate, high levels of the hormone cortisol, and high activity in the right frontal lobe of the brain. So this is from research from that Kagan from the other slide, 2013. This pattern may be tied to excitability of the amygdala, right? And that would make total sense because the amygdala is so connected with the emotional response, especially stuff around stress. This pattern may be tied to the excitability of the amygdala, a structure in the brain that plays an important role in fear and inhibition. Twin and adoption studies have also showed that heredity plays a moderate influence on differences in temperament, right? So that's where it says studies suggest that heredity has a moderate influence, right? So like we know that to at least a certain amount, your parents and your genetic inheritance affects temperament. But it's not just that, or else all brothers and sisters would be basically the same, and we just know from our common experience that's not the same. You and your sister are maybe very different if you have a sister. Right, and if it was all just heredity, you guys inherited very similar genetic material, assuming like you have the same biological parents in this made-up hypothetical. So it's like that. So it can't be just heredity, right? And then that's that last piece, right? So it's like the first point there is like just the point, and then the second point is kind of a shout out to nature, and the bottom point's a shout out to nurture. That actually there's a learning piece too, and kids can be taught to be more fearful. They can also taught to be less fearful, or you could also say more courageous. What do we mean by this word self? Right, and it's like we know, what does it mean to be the thinker of your thoughts, the witness to your experience? I don't know. I'm just trying to be trippy, but at a certain point, it's this mind expanding thought of what do we even mean by this word self, like that you have something uniquely psychologically your experience, right? Like what do we even mean? We don't just mean your memory. We don't just mean your tastes and preferences, although that is interesting, both those things. But we mean this like thing that you kind of identify with and that you see yourself as, and that like I would think of as Mike. I would say like Mike's not just like my physical hands or my skin or my jawbone or my head or even my heart and lungs, or I identify at a certain part mainly with my, like we think of ourselves as logical. We think of ourselves as very much psychological entities. What does that mean? What does it mean to think of yourself as your own unique self that's different than other people? Right? And how is seeing yourself, how is seeing that you're not connected with other people and you're your own being key to starting to see that, well, actually, so is everybody else. And we start to realize that, like, everyone else has this individualized experience too. We're going to talk about the emergence of self, the emergence of this idea of, like, I'm a stable, I'm trying not to use the word identity, I'm a stable pattern, right? Like, you start to show yourself that you respond certain ways in certain situations. You start to see that certain people respond to you in certain ways. You start to see that you do certain things and you don't do other things, and you're in certain groups and not in certain groups. And like, what is this emerging sense of who you think you are and how you think you fit into the world, and where does this start? What are the origins of that? And I hope this slide made some sense. I tried to do it a little different. I just rambled that, but I was trying to just talk about this kind of, or highlight this and make you just pause for a bit. And even if I seem silly, it's like, it doesn't matter. Like, as long as you pause and in your own mind think, like, that's pretty wild. It's pretty wild that everyone is going through this world through this personalized filter that we call the self, and that, like, we just hardly ever talk about that. And it's like, I don't know, it's one of those things. It's like we can talk forever or we can never talk about it. It's like, it's like a foundational aspect of your experience of the world. Next slide. I love this class. I hope you guys think this is decent. I don't know. Anyways, I gotta stop saying stuff like that, because just keep teaching. I'll just do my thing, alright? This is fun. Next slide. Okay, so I'm gonna just keep playing with this. So think about this idea of self, right? And I was talking about self as like this kind of personalized aspect of your psychology, and that's exactly what the subjective self is, right? So we start to realize that, like, I might be making that point, and there might be, say, well, this is all weird because it's all pre-recorded in this, in a sense of like talking about a shared experience, but let's say just for whatever reason, two of you started watching this video at the exact same time, and one of you is like just completely engaged and like really interested in what I'm talking about, and the other one is just like, just say the points we need for the test and keep going. Like, this is, like, and the thing is like, obviously there's going to be that range. It's like, I took university myself. I paid tuition to Waterloo for like 13 years, and a lot of that's because it took me forever to finish my PhD because I was working full time and had a baby, but or my wife had a baby, obviously, but like that took it added time to my process, let me just say. But I get the fact that not every class is the most interesting, but I hope, I'm just trying to make these as engaging as I can, and I think the point I'm trying to make here is like, one person could be taking it as really interesting and someone else is really boring. What's that mean? If we objectively recorded the class, it's just one thing. It's just me making certain vocalizations, that you're hearing as words, and we talked about that last time, but like, that at a certain point there's just this class happening. I'm saying certain things, showing certain slides. It's kind of interesting that two human brains can look at that and one can be interested by it and another one can think it's boring, right? It's like, that is so neat. The ability of, well, now we're getting into preference, and that's one of like the hardest things to understand about psychology. You'd think it'd be easy, But like even just simple things like why you like country music and I like hip hop, or you like ice cream and I prefer potato chips. It's like that's actually kind of complex. It sounds like a silly surface level thing, but it's actually not. So anyways, that's a side point. Subjective self is this idea that the baby starts to learn that like their inner world is their own. This point I was saying just a second ago before I went on that food rant, but like that you might be sitting here and thinking this is boring and someone else might be thinking that it's good. And you might be sitting right beside each other and you might both be going like, say this was a live class, you might both be like active listening and pretending like you're engaged. And it's like this subjective internal experience that you're this continuous person. You know, subjective self and infant's awareness that they're a separate person who experiences time and space. So now think about that. That sounds like a trippy way of saying it, but it's like they start to realize that like tomorrow and next week and a year from now, I'm still going to be like, say, my daughter Evelyn. And I like certain things and I don't like certain things, and some people are my friends and some people aren't my friends. They're starting to realize they're their own person, right? And I'm saying like this is something that is an emerging thing, this self-concept, this idea of you as your own person is something. I don't want to say you weren't born with it because you were born predisposed to do it, but it emerged. Usually babies become fully aware of that subjective self by about a year. And I don't know if just because it's on the screen, I'll just talk real quick about this idea of object permanence, because this is another cool idea. Right? So like look at me for a sec. Like you all knew that as soon as I brought my hand away, I was still there. Right? It's like I can't play peekaboo on a bunch of 25-year-olds. It's like, but when my daughter was 1, it's like I left the world. Right? It was like what wasn't directly experiential to her didn't exist. Objects weren't permanent. Right? But as the kid gets to closer to 1, it's why like if a kid's like 2 years old and you're like, peekaboo, they'll just be like, that's dumb. That's dumb. They'll just pull your hands down. Because they understand that reality is not based on them seeing it. But what I'm saying is that there's a cognitive difference. That's why peekaboo is predictive almost in term. Now again, there's always variation, but there's a certain level of predictiveness of how a kid will respond to peekaboo based solely just by age, like 100% by just how many months they've been alive, how good they are at processing. It's basically like almost like, again, you can see how people have in the past used the metaphor of a computer. It's almost a processing power thing. They're just getting better at, but it's not just that. It's also this idea of how they're seeing themselves in relation to stuff. It's not just a brain power thing. Again, don't scramble writing down all this rant I'm doing. Just focus your points on like the stuff I'm saying on the screen, basically. But I'm trying to just add context to this idea that this is actually complicated, because what we're really talking about is the formation of the early stages of a mind, not a brain. Yeah, so I should have just waited for this slide, but this kind of just nicely adds to it, right? It's like, you didn't disappear, you just covered your eyes, right? It's like that kid, I don't know why I find that so hilarious, but on like the top, my top left, whatever, the top picture, it's like the kid's sitting there, that face is hilarious. It's like, hey, just wait a second here. And it's like they start to realize like it's because they're able to take a mental step they weren't able to take before. They have an understanding that objects continue to exist even when they can't be observed. All right, you all know that this globe will be here between now and next lecture. It's like that seems just like a silly, ridiculous thing to say to a bunch of adults. Now some of you are thinking about like quantum physics and stuff and wanting to make an argument about particles and observer effects and stuff, but it's like things there. Right? There's a objective reality. Objects are permanent within reason. Self.
in addition to the subjective self we've been talking about, as the kid's getting older, they also start to develop this idea of, how do I compare to other people? There's some people that are taller than me. There's some people that I'm taller than. There's some people, that I'm stronger than, and there's people that are stronger than me. And they start to understand that the categories they fit in and how they relate to other people. And we start to see that the toddler's understanding that she's defined by various categories, such as, I'm a boy and my cousin Audrey's, say my daughter, I should have said, my daughter's like, I'm a girl, my cousin Audrey's a girl, my cousin Felix and Dexter are both boys. My daughter could have said that when she was, almost as soon as she started talking. That ability, and she probably understood that before she could even say it. And the kids start to understand that, what we call a categorical or an objective self, that they're like people in certain ways and they're not like people in certain ways. Like another example would be shyness. Like my daughter might be able to say that like her one cousin's less shy than her, but she's more shy than a different cousin. And the important point here is the comparative aspect. A child develops the initial self-awareness that delineates, or that kind of comes and shows this kind of formation of this objective self by the middle of the second year of life. So by the time the kid's like 2.5, they're starting this delineates, meaning like you can make a line and kind of show that on this side they didn't have it, on this side they did, right? And that you start to see that they have this objective self. And then this last idea, by late in the second year, a child can start to label themselves in several ways, like, and this is obviously dependent on their emerging speech, but it's like they'll be able to tell you, like, I'm Evie and I'm a girl and I have blonde hair and I'm not as tall as Dexter, but I'm taller than Harvey, and and she can, I'm just using names from my own family, but like she can start to see how she kind of, her understanding of who she is becoming more complex and more multi-layered and more multifaceted. And it's like, before we talked about the subjective self, and then there's this objective self, and there's going to be a building on emotional self and a spiritual aspect, and it's not like it's actual different things, it's just who you are is adding levels of complexity, layers of complexity and nuance and dynamic. Psychodynamics, right? Little Freud shadow, but just meaning this idea that you're just, who you are is getting more complex and more multi-layered, and a more difficult question to quickly answer. Old graph, but it's really interesting. It's not that old, I guess. It's 1979. That seems like, or 78. I was born in 81, so this even predates an old guy like me, but this is a classic. This is Lewis and Brooks, 1978. This is a mirror recognition test. So what they did is they had kids and they would put like a little bit of rouge or whatever, red makeup on their face, and then they would just get the kid to look into a mirror, and they would see if the kid would like go like this, right? Because what you're trying to see is like, does the kid look and notice themselves and know that they're seeing themselves and know that something's different than what they usually see themselves as? Are they self-referent? Right, so that's just the word, right? And there's like, oh, I have, it's like, that's what self-referent would be like, I have a coffee. It's like, it's just talking about yourself, like self-referring, right? And you see that like their ability to say something like that increases kind of from 15 months to 2 years, and also that you see that like the percentage of them, by the time that we get to 2 years, almost all of them are touching that. But when you're at like under a year, less than a quarter are, or like way less than a quarter, right? Like, I don't even know, like, I don't know, like 7% or something. Right, like the actual number you could look up in that study, but the kind of general directionality of the curve is kind of what I'm trying to make this point, is that from a broader developmental perspective, it's like at 1, almost a small percentage are doing it, by 2, almost everyone is. So that's just a clear example of, it's not necessarily individual differences. This is a pretty clear example of a developmental age-based difference, right? So it's kind of cool, because it's like, as you get to 2 years, it's like almost everybody.
Yeah, this is a classic graph.
Keep going on this because there's this continually intensifying complexity of what the self is. And so we talked about kind of the subjective self and the objective self, and now the emotional self. And again, I'll make this point just because it bears repetition, or deserves repetition, that like it's all just you. It's all just the infant's mind. But what is the mind? It's more than brain functioning. It's this complex understanding of, well, self is like part of mind. It's like, see these, I gotta limit myself because I could go on forever on just the difference between the brain, the self, and the mind. Right? That's like the core of just that conversation, is kind of the foundational heart of psychology as a field. This idea that the development of the emotional, I'll just come back to this because I'm gonna just stop myself because I could go all day on that, because I think that's the core of what psychology is really, is like, what is it to talk about the functionality and the process of the mind as more than just brain activity. Because then you're because it is brain activity, but it's also just not that, right? It's like when you're dreaming, you're experiencing something, you're having certain brain activity. It's not just the brain activity though. It's also the experience of, it's the embedded, embodied experience of that brain activity. Again, while awake or while asleep. I've made a lot of dream references in this presentation for some reason. But yeah, that this idea that this emotional self, now think about this, a big factor in the development of the baby's ability to read emotions is also connected with their ability to understand faces. And that these two things are actually really connected. We talked about that a lot in chapter 3. That the development of the emotional self begins when the baby learns to identify changes in the emotions expressed in others. So that my baby starts to, or my daughter starts to understand when I'm mad or when I'm happy or when I'm frustrated. And that her being able to read me actually starts to help her be able to understand herself. As the infant's understanding of self advances, it's matched in a parallel progression in the baby's expression of emotion. So as the baby starts to understand themselves, it has a behavioral change. Right? It's matched by this progression or this improvement in the baby's expression of emotions. They're starting to, remember, this is this idea of they're starting to get a better grasp of the emotional dimension of reality, of their reality and their, so they're starting to understand that, like, I get mad, daddy also gets mad, or mom gets mad, or, and sometimes I'm not mad, and sometimes I am, and sometimes I can calm myself back down, and just their understanding of that whole emotional piece is getting added to their kind of mental world. Again, we have to kind of not deconstruct, we need to kind of, at least as a thought experiment, kind of compartmentalize our adult experience, because it's so integrated that it sounds almost silly to talk about adding these things, but it's like we don't see evidence of kids having these things until certain stages, right? And so, again, this is one of the hard things about psychology, because you're always learning about psychology as adults, talking about what it was like to think as kids, and we're so removed from that. I like to say this to students, it's like, and I might, forgive me if I've already said this to your group, but like, it's easy to think of, I'm 40 now, it's easy to think of how different I was when I was 30, but it's harder to think of how different I'll be when I'm 50, right? It's like if you're 20, it's easy for you to think that when you were 10, you're a totally different person than when you're 20, but then when you're 30, you're going to be significantly different too, right? It's like, yeah. Sorry, I kind of forget how I got on that point, but next slide. I love you all. This is a fun class. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. I'm on my second coffee. Let's keep this party going. Class going.
just wanted to show you this additionally too. So this was on the right here. You see the Lewis and Brooks study that I showed you is the green, and then the Amsterdam study was like a replication of it that showed it even stronger. The same kind of ideas. That this idea of being attentive and positive towards oneself in an image started to really, we see the beginnings of it around 3 months of them just kind of noticing themselves. Like you go to my daughter now at 4, she's like obsessed with like singing in the mirror. It's like that attraction to mirrors. There's something primal about that, right? That reflection. Humans have been seeing themselves in reflective pools for hundreds of, or whatever, for our entire evolutionary past. It's like there's something about, it's like other animals. It's actually, I should maybe just include this. That's the one advantage of doing them like this, because I'm doing it one slide at a time. I can pause, and I didn't have it, but I'm going to include this animal mirror video because it shows how you can see as kind of animal developing intelligence, how they react to seeing themselves in a mirror, right? And only some animals will actually realize it's themselves, like the chimps, the primates, some of the big cats, but it even confuses a lot of them. Right, so being able to notice that you're looking at yourself is actually a sign of intelligence. Obviously, like dolphins and whales and stuff can do that. Dolphins are whales. It's kind of confusing way of saying it, but late second year, early third year, we see this emerging self-awareness that reflects a sense of me, right? Like they start to understand what this idea of me is. This autonomy starts to build. So they start to get, remember, autonomy is like the same root word, auto. The same root word is like an autobiography or an automobile. It's like self. It's like autonomy means like being able to make decisions that affect your own experience. So to give a counterexample, it'd be like in prison when they tell you when you eat, when you go to the bathroom, when you shower, when you can change, when you can call people. It's like there's like very little autonomy in that scenario, right? Very little ability to make decisions about things that control your experience. So again, that doesn't have direct relevance to this, just in terms of defining the word. In this context, it's like the child's trying to develop. It's like my daughter wanting to put her own shoes on. She wants to do her own thing. She wants to have autonomy, and this autonomy and this wanting to be more, the other way you could say this is the kid wanting to be independent. This desire to be more independent and do things themselves is actually linked with this as a motivational stimulus almost to develop some of these motor skills and motor abilities. So it's kind of interesting, right? It's like this sense of the kid to want to do things is actually providing a motivational impetus to like actually start doing things and start developing skills, even the very physical skills. Had a video cool that was just, I try not to talk in it because I just wanted to make sure that that saved nicely and stuff. And if what I'm saying doesn't make sense, it's because YouTube didn't let me put it up with that and I had to cut it out. But hopefully you just saw those animals reacting to the mirrors. So the infant becomes aware of this self-concept that I've been talking about, this internal mental state that they have. Now, of course, they couldn't articulate it like that, but they start to realize that they have a mind of their own by 2 years of age. We start to see that a child develops this capacity to basically have what we would call joint attention, right? And we've talked about this already, but this idea of like being able to, hey, Evie, look at this. Let's both focus on writing and working on our letters right now. Me and my daughter are like working on our letters and like literally like how to write the alphabet. And she's got a pretty good attention, but like trying to keep joint attention means not just her paying attention, but us kind of both paying attention at the same thing. A child's attention or a child's capacity to pay attention to both another person's intention and an object. So both like kind of stay in the same wavelength as me and work on our letters. So it's like, it's just a more complex cognitive skill than we would think as adults. For example, to draw someone's attention to a toy is a form of joint attention is related to later development of look at how much important things. So that ability to develop joint attention early is related later to the development of language, to their intellectual development, to their behavioral development, to their emotional adjustment. Right? So like how much of that is their life, right? Like how much would your life be affected by your development of language, your development of your intellectual and behavioral and emotional adjustment? Right, so this development of joint attention is an important thing. So when we look at the experience of parents and early relationships with their children, what we see is that like children differ from each other, and the fact that the children are different has an effect on the parenting interaction, right? So even within a family, brothers and sisters can be different, and so they'll interact with the parents differently. And so that's at a certain point, it's like a discussion of fit, like how well does the fit of the parenting style match with the style of the child? The goodness of fit is the term that they use, right? This goodness of fit is the match between the child's temperament and the emotional demands the child must cope with, right? I kind of talked about this earlier, about this idea of like, say a child gets stressed out easy and they have a mom that's like really overbearing. Well, that can be a difficult situation, but say if a child had a really low threshold or a really high threshold and can actually really stand the stress of that easily, it's like maybe that wouldn't be as much of an issue. So it's like that fit matters. A lack of fit can produce adjustment problems. Researchers have found that decreases in infants' negative emotionality are linked to higher levels of parental sensitivity, involvement, and responsiveness, right? So like this idea that kids that have this, that get stressed out easy and have parents that are kind of on them all the time, that can have a link to like negative emotionality down the road, right? That's why parenting is so complex and difficult, because it's such a balancing act. It's like too much of everything is a problem and too little of everything is a problem. And that's why as a parent, it's so, you sometimes feel like you're running in circles, because you're like, I thought, bananas are good, bananas are bad. It's like, I just made that up, but it's like, it feels like it's this constant attempt to kind of find this Goldilocks middle ground where you're not doing too much or too little. And as a parent, you can do as good as you can do, but it's true that there's so much of this is fit, right? And parenting styles plays a role, because just like I said that all kids are different, it's like you already all know, obviously all parents are different too. We're all different, just humans are different. So there's different kinds of kids mixing with different kinds of parents. So this is what this goodness of fit concept means. It's like, this is actually one of the most complex and important variables of parenting that is easy to kind of just describe and then just move on to the next topic. But really, it's an important variable, variable in understanding how these interaction patterns develop, is understanding this, like kind of the personality of the parent
the relation, and then if there's two parents in the marriage or family, or whether they're married or not, it's like if there's two people, then it's like that relational dynamic has a role too. And then if there's siblings, so it's like this, now we're getting into like family dynamics, but there's a lot of fit, how things fit going on, and how good is that fit. Ethology. Okay, ethology. The study of human behavior and social organization from a biological perspective. So what can biology teach us about how human beings behave and why we organize socially the way that we do? Right? What is it that biology can add to the puzzle? Or what piece can it add to the puzzle? Or this, our developing understanding about this? And the reason I'm using this is because we're about to talk about an ethological approach to understanding human attachment. Okay, so I just wanted to present what this word is before I'm about to use this in a different context. So ethology is just using a biological view to look at human behavior, and whether we're just talking about how we behave or how we organize socially, right? Like in a mother-child relationship is what we're going to be talking about.
So in your other courses, you may have come across Ainsworth and Bowlby, like they're quite famous psychologists, but I don't know if you've heard them approached or discussed as, I should just put the last one up there. The reason I do that is because sometimes when I have a big list, if I might have told you this, but just from how these videos make, if I forget a point, it kind of messes up the video. So I want to make sure I have them all on the screen. But anyways, this idea of these two people are really important in terms of the history of psychology in their contribution to our understanding of attachment relationships. And they're looking at it from this perspective of an ethological perspective, right? Like, what can biology teach us about this? Because a lot of these attachment behaviors are similar with other mammals. They're not unique just to human beings. Attachment theory is the view that the ability and the need to form an attachment relationship early in life are actually genetic characteristics of human beings. It's a genetic thing. So think about that for a sec. It's like saying that it's a genetic, this tie between mom and baby has genetic characteristics. And that really, to talk about that, we have to be more specific because we're talking about two things. We're talking about an attachment relationship that's formed between baby and mom. And we're talking about, now, I'll just finish this point and then I'll clarify. And then there's an affectionate bond or an emotional tie between mom and baby. So within attachment theory, there's this idea that it's an attachment between mom and baby, and I'll add a point on that in a sec. And then when we're talking about mom's relationship to baby, we're calling that an affectionate bond, which just means an emotional connection. And then when we're talking about baby to mom, we're talking about attachment, that baby's actually hasn't developed this subjective self yet, is actually psychologically and evolutionarily, survival-wise, dependent completely on mom. Attached, completely attached in every sense of the word. And having just recently been literally physically attached. Now, the question that people will ask is like, well, obviously there's a lot of situations where babies and young infants aren't being raised by biological mom. And so, again, I think that like the most important thing for babies is attention and love. Right? So just always remember that's the most important thing. And babies are raised in all kinds of different situations. Now, a lot of the research is a lot of the early research, at least in developmental psychology, is with baby and biological mom. So a lot of the talk is about that. And I'm kind of talking that way, and I don't want to
make all these slides super long by adding this disclaimer every time, but I do want to acknowledge very specifically that like there's a lot of situations in which kids are raised. Like sometimes it's by grandparents, sometimes it's by an aunt, sometimes it's by in an adoptive or foster situation. There's a wide range of people that are in that role, right? So I just wanted to say that. I think it's just important to say that. I just wanted to say this point one more time, and you don't necessarily have to have this in your notes. It's not going to be a question about this, but I wanted to make this point that the majority of parents actually do develop into what we would consider successful attachment relationships with their kids. But when we're looking at this, it's important to look at both sides of this. It's important to look at the contributing role the parents play, and also how differences in the baby's engagement styles affect it. So we're going to be focusing on both the baby's attachment to primary caregiver / mom, and then mom's attachment to baby, and both sides of those situations, both sides of that affectionate bond and that attachment, right? Because it's just saying that the child's directional attachment is so much deeper. It's so much more based on survival. It's so much more or not so much more, but it's precognitive almost. It's like it's an attachment. There's almost nothing else like it, except if you look at infancy in all other mammals, right? So there's across species, there's similarities. Yeah, it's actually, if you actually let yourself get a little bit deep into it, it's like this idea of attachment is actually super complex. It's super deep. It's the deepest psychological idea almost that there is. That it's almost a psychological attachment. They're the same. They're attached, right? It's like, I know you guys are like, okay, yeah, we understand, we're adults, we are smart university students, so we get what the word attached means, but it's like, yeah, but just sometimes just not tripping out, but just, I don't mean it that way, I'm talk like I was raised in the 80s and 90s, but it's like just understanding that it's like that's actually a incredibly intense concept, that they're actually psychologically connected, like almost like a pack of wolves. It's like pack of wolves see themselves as not as individuals. So yeah, so this is that comment I just made about wolves, which is a very like ethological thing to say, like to make an animal comparative relationship, because a mother wolf there's a lot of similarities in other animals, is what I'm saying. Okay, next slide. So here's an important concept in this conversation, sort of, is this idea of how we're really talking about sync, right? Like what the level, we called it before goodness to fit, but I think this is just at a certain level, I like this terminology, this idea of a mutual interlocking pattern of attachment behaviors that are shared by parent and child. It's this like melding of not just it's this synchronization of behavior and emotional response, and here, let me just show you, because I almost did it and then I stopped myself. It's like in class I'll be like, I always make this joke of like, and now that I can see myself in the video, I'm like, I almost like paused myself because I'm like, oh, I'm gonna look dumb. But like in class I'll be like, hey, if I brought Evie in and introduced her to you, what would you do? It's like, you're not going to be like, hey, what's up? How are you? What do you think about politics? You're probably going to be like, hey, how's it going? Hi. And you'll probably get lower. Your voice will probably get higher pitched. You'll start lengthening out your vowels. You'll probably open up your body without even noticing. You're going to get softer in general, right? And it's like, this is what's interesting. I wouldn't tell you to do anything. I wouldn't tell any of you to do any of those things. But you almost at a genetic level know to do that. Most adults automatically display a distinctive pattern of interactive behaviors and vocal styles towards infants. It's like this is part of a hardwired, because why? Because if you're like super stern and strict, it's like the kid's going to be like, whoa. It's like we purposely present ourselves as softer. We sort of do the same thing with dogs if we like dogs or whatever too. It's like it's an opening move. It's like a social. It's an approach behavior, right? It's a deep pattern of behavior. The degree of synchronicity or synchrony, or like how synced parent and child is, that how synced that interaction is, seems to be linked with cognitive development. So that's an important point, right? That the child's early sync in those important initial relationships seems to, and it's not that shocking that would be the case, that would set their cognitive processing model kind of in motion, right? And that contributes to their cognitive development. Now, this is a kind of, obviously I want to make this point and then add a point. So fathers and mothers interact differently with infants. The research on this is pretty clear that there's different. Now there's obviously exceptions. This makes more sense if we're talking about in broad sweeps, that there's different styles of interaction. Now people often in class, when I've presented on topics like this, because remember I've taught lots of live developmental psychology courses for the last decade, and people will often ask things about like, well, obviously in 2020 there's families where it's two dads or two moms, or one mom or one dad, or it's grandma, or it's like some of the situations I was talking about before, like a foster situation or an adopted situation, or like there's just such a diversity of how people are raised. So I think one of the better ways you could almost frame this is that children benefit from interactions with males and females. And so, for example, if it was two males raising a child, it would be a good idea to have, say, if one of those males has like a sister that they're really close with, having her involved in the kid's life. And then the same thing if it was the like two women with a kid, having like a brother that is cool, that you're friends with and is a good person and that it gets along with your kid, like having them involved in the life. It's like, it's more the idea that kids benefit from those different influences. I hope that made sense, that babies benefit from both types of interactions. And I think it's just interesting to think about this picture. And my wife doesn't like this picture because this is like hours after she gave birth. This is right in front of the Kitchener Hospital. All right, so this is like, oh man, this is a day that changed a lot of things. I'm doing this. We're doing, like, she wanted to, I don't know if you care about this, but my wife's like big into the British royal family. I'm not, but she is. But anyways, she wanted to, like, I guess the royals did some picture with their baby in front of the hospital, and she wanted to do it. So anyways, that's just a little glimpse into my life. But yeah, this idea that me and my wife, let me just use this example. I guess I'll just talk personally. Like, we interact with Evie very differently. We have different experiences with her. Like her and my wife play a lot of games and stuff like that, whereas like me and Evie hang out more. Like, for example, me and Evie today like went to the park and like we'll play around in the backyard, and then like down here, if I could flip the camera, I could show you like this side of the room's like bookshelf, and there's another bookshelves here and stuff, but then that side of the room there's like a couch and a TV and stuff, and this is like kind of down here is like half my office and half me and my daughter's movie theater sometimes, right? So it's like we just have different styles of interaction, and kids benefit from both those styles. And like not like I'm not trying to be super stereotypical, like there's a specific dad style and mom style, but like there's qualities that are being added from both sides, even though there's a diversity of how that manifests. So now I wanted to, you don't have to necessarily have this in your notes. Like, you might notice that a few of these slides are covering things that aren't directly in the textbook, just because I've taught on this before and there's a few points I wanted to make that the textbook didn't make specifically. So again, like I think it would make sense. It's integrated in, like just for example, like adding the definition of ethology and stuff like that. I'm just trying to think of where I can add to stuff. And I wanted to add this idea that this child is starting to get these internal models of what the world is. And when we're talking about what it actually is, what is attachment actually experienced as in the mind of the child? Now, first of all, it's whether they think that their parent is, or see, I don't want to keep saying this a million times, but let's just say, yeah, the attachment figure. So whoever the attachment figure is, how available are they? Are they going to respond if the baby starts to cry or if it's needed? If they're in need, will there be a response? So how available is it? What's the expectation that if they do come, if I cry, so let's just say, like, theoretically, again, the baby couldn't obviously articulate this, but in the baby's mind, if I cry, will anybody come? And if they do come, will they have an emotional reaction? Like, will they help? Will they rebuff, or will they be affectionate? Right? And like, this all links to this idea of like, is this attachment figure a safe base? Now again, Erikson called this the development of this idea of like trust, right? Erikson's idea is like the first developmental stage is like the baby's trying to, and I think I have that coming up, but you can just add that to your note if you want, because that's like the key point that Erikson said that, and again, Erikson, just like Erikson, Erikson's idea that like during this infancy stage, the child's trying to learn whether or not it trusts the world. And this is like a super deep idea, right? And part of it is this attachment figure a safe base? Now, why does this matter? Because by the time the child's like, so this idea of the internal model becomes elaborated from the time a child's 1 until they're about 4 or 5. We think that their internal model is kind of set. Now think of what an internal model is. It's like their understanding of what relationship is, what trust is. Yeah, it's a pretty deep, complex idea.
This experiment, which I watched through a two-way mirror, is designed to gauge how secure is the crucial relationship between mother and child.
Okay, this bunny is going to go here, and that bunny will be on top.
The value of the test has been established in studies that would watch a child, 1-year-old, and then follow it up and interview them about their relationships to their parents when they were 21 years old. So we're quite confident in the long-term significance of this relationship.
Peter, that's Peter.
After several minutes' play, the mother is signaled to leave the room.
Sweetie, I'll be back in 1 minute, okay? I'll get you back in 1 minute.
It's upsetting for you. Shame, I feel. But she'll survive. The key moment in the experiment is the child's reaction to her mother's return.
Hi. Hi. It's okay.
The important clue is whether the baby's able to become calmed down by the contact with the mother and get back to play. Sometimes it takes a couple of minutes. But you see, when the mother was out, she was only interested in the mother, no interest in the toys. Now she has a contact with the mother. She's beginning to show a little interest in the environment, and shortly she'll be right back with the toys where we started.
So you would call this a secure one?
Yes, yes.
She's certainly much happier.
Goes to the door following her. Now, we sent the mother right back in, but the point here is not to distress the baby. We're just trying to challenge it. The baby puts her hands to her face in a sad expression, puts her face down. When she picks her up, she keeps her head down, her arms out, and then she sits in the chair holding the baby. The baby's still sullen. He's low-keyed.
So you would call this insecure
Yes,
attachment?
insecure. He's avoidant. He's not engaging her and it's not being, the reunion's not effective. And it's important to remember here that the thing that upset him was her absence. Her return should be the solution to his problem. Now this is another pattern that we see in babies who are not good at using their mother as a secure base at home. This baby is also insecure. But you'll see, we get a look at his play before the separation. The mother's left, and when she returns, she picks him up. He can't calm down. He's still upset. She offers a toy to amuse him or to comfort him or to distract him, and he slaps it away. She offers another. He slaps it away. He's angry. We call these babies resistant or ambivalent because they both want her back and yet can't use the contact. We think that the difficulty is that in the past, when he sought comfort, she's been inconsistent as to whether she's available and responsive or not.
So, as you saw in that video, so let's just get some that definition down for our note. So there's kind of these 4 different classifications you could use, right? So classification just meaning that we could say that there's different types of ways that kids react in these situations, or that more specifically parents or caregivers and children develop attachment relationships in different ways, and you could kind of classify them in these 4 different ways, right? Remember, Ainsworth was doing this experiment with countless people and sort of noticing that there's these patterns, and some people are more securely attached. The kids are able to use the caregiver as a secure base and then explore out in the environment, meaning that they can, like in that example, they might be really upset and then mom comes back in the room and the baby kind of is able to calm back down and then go back and start to play, or the infant, I should say. Right, the infants that are more insecurely avoidant, there's sort of like the secure, and then there's 3 types of insecure. So there's insecure avoidant, and that's just kind of like what the word means, where you saw the baby where it was upset that mom was gone, caregiver was gone, caregiver comes back. You'd think that that would calm it down, but it's like literally physically like pulling away, and it's like avoidant and not wanting mom back, but having difficulty using mom as a source of emotional regulation. Same with insecure, right? The same want. The want was for mom to come back, but like both clinging and resisting, right? So it's just like, sometimes they used to call that ambivalent, which means like ambivalent would be like, say you wanted to go to a party, but you also didn't want to go. Like there's someone there that you don't really like, but at the same time you sort of wanted to see someone else, so you're like, you could say you're ambivalent about going to that party. It's like yes or no. It's like the kids kind of like ambivalent, like they want the mom, but they're not able to use the mom to calm them down at the same time. And then in situations where there might be like abuse or neglect in some of the most tough to talk about situations, we sometimes would call this an insecure, disorganized attachment relationship. Highly disorganized, highly disoriented, and just think what disoriented means. The infant's not able to understand what the relationship is, almost, right? That it's disorganized. It's not oriented. It's not a clear path. It might appear dazed, confused, fearful. So to this point, we've just kind of basically said, like, shown a little bit of video about it and labeled the types, but where does this come from? And if we look at the origins, and this is another piece that I'm just adding, this is not in the textbook, and but I want you to know this because this is key, and you don't have to do any outside research. Just pay attention, or I don't need to tell you to pay attention. I didn't mean to say that, but just note what's on these slides. So in terms of origins, where does a secure attachment come from, or in terms a lack of that, like an insecure attachment? A key piece is this emotional availability now of the primary caregiver is key. Now notice that it doesn't say physical availability or just availability. It says like emotional availability, that it's actually emotionally valuable physical availability. that there's a contingent responsiveness. So that's an important word. Contingent responsiveness means like when the baby needs to be changed, the mom doesn't try to feed it, right? That, no, I'm not saying that the mom has to be perfect. I'm just saying that like being contingent means when the baby's needs something, what is being provided for the baby is what they need. Contingent responsiveness, being sensitive to the child's cues and responding appropriately, right? And that the mom is understanding when, like, it's like, and that's really confusing, like when you're a new parent. I can understand. It's like I can remember being like, when my daughter was young, it's like you just wish they could talk and just tell you what's wrong, because it's like I've changed her diaper, I've, she's been fed, she's like whatever. It's like you're trying to understand how to match that, and it's like, so I'm not saying that people have to be perfect, but there's a huge spectrum of how much contingent responsiveness parents have. Right, and we talked earlier about the term sync, the sync between two. It's, remember, and I made that kind of claim earlier that we really have to be talking about this as like a two-sided relationship, attachment relationship. Okay, so if we, on the last slide, we're talking about this idea of what are the origins of attachment, and I was saying, okay, well, at a certain point, we really have to look at this idea of emotional responsiveness and contingent responsiveness, I meant to say, and emotional availability. Now, let's take this another step. When we're talking about avoidant attachment, this is often a response to situations where the parental contribution to the situation is either overstimulation or understimulation. And this is, again, why parenting is so complex, because we're talking again about this almost like Goldilocks idea. And I apologize for all the kid references, but it's like, well, I guess we are talking about kid psychology, but this Goldilocks story, right? And if you're unfamiliar, like the basic of the story is like, the one bowl of porridge is too hot, the other bowl is too cold, but the middle porridge is just right. And it's like, with parenting, there's so many situations where too much of something or too little of something can have a problematic effect. And this is definitely one scenario where we're talking about how much stimulation or how much like attention is given towards the baby, that can, you can be overstimulating to a baby. And remember, before we talked about, especially based on this idea that babies have different thresholds for that. So oftentimes that avoidant attachment that we saw in the video of like the baby that wanted mom to come back, but then when she came back, it was like kind of like physically, literally like physically withdrawing. Right, and again, like, and like kind of avoiding, right? And then this resistant, ambivalent. So oftentimes, so now a lot, you see it a lot, like in the textbook that we're using, it's called resistant. And I think it had ambivalent in brackets, or it made reference to that at some point. The language used to be ambivalent. It used to be, that's what it was called. Now think about ambivalent as this. I always say this in class, and it's an easy way to think of the word. If you probably already know what it means, but just in case you don't, it's like just this idea, if I was to ask you, maybe there's a party you want to go to next weekend and there's someone there that you like, that you want to talk to because they're your buddy, but there's someone else there that you don't like, and so you kind of want to go and you kind of don't want to go. You could say that you're ambivalent about going. You want to, but you also don't want to. And it's like the child has an attachment like that where they want mom back, but they're not able to use that as a source for emotional stabilization and regulation. And that's more common with inconsistent or unreliable parents. Again, I'm not trying to make any moral judgment on people being parenting, but in Ainsworth's research, she's looking at patterns, generalized patterns of effect. And then here, the last idea here is that this, and this is like the toughest one, is that this disorganized, disoriented attachment patterns is often the result of some of the, most difficult to talk about and traumatizing types of situations where there's been abusive situations, or maybe the child's exposed to abusive situations, or it's in that kind of context where we see more likelihood of this disorganized, disoriented attachment. Now, again, the majority of parent-child relationships are secure attachments, and things can be improved and stuff. And I don't want to give the impression that if a mom is, if these attachments aren't good early, that it's necessarily a prediction of all these things. But at the same time, it does have effect. So this is the thing in psychology. It's like we're saying, that's why I liked that term earlier when I said like it's suggestive of things, that it makes things more likely later. It doesn't actually predict it though, because there's just such a variety of other factors, right? Things don't exist in isolation. And basically people are also influenced by therapeutic influences, so things can get better. I think that's just an important point to make when we're talking about something as deep as attachment. Okay, we're 2 hours and 20 minutes in. Wow, I should just keep going. That's assuming I'm able to keep both those videos in, because if they get flagged on YouTube, it's really easy. I can just it just is kind of time consuming. I can just cut it out. I'll have to send you an email that I'm doing that, but it'll affect how deep we're into it. But anyways, I didn't have to say that out loud. 2:20 in, we got just a few more minutes here, maybe another 20 minutes. I just want to kind of wrap this all up nicely, hopefully. All right, next slide. So here's just to make a complex thing more complex. Significant changes in relationships can affect attachment patterns, right? So this could be a whole variety of things. This could be perhaps, and I know the problem with a course like developmental psychology is like every topic is a personal topic, because we're talking about my life, your life, all of our lives. It's like human life, human experience in general, and it's like significant changes in that it can be happening at a level of, maybe we're talking about a divorce, maybe we're talking about another sibling being born, maybe we're talking about all kinds of different things that can happen that can change attachment relationships. So part of this idea of that attachment classifications, when we're talking about how stable they are, we need to recognize that there can be things that affect at a relational level that are beyond just that simple, or not that simple, but that specific emotional attachment, right? That significant changes in relationship can change those patterns. Bowlby suggests, so again, Bowlby and Ainsworth are the two that really are known for this attachment research. Bowlby suggests that by age 4 or 5, the child's internalized this attachment pattern. We kind of talked about that with that internal model idea earlier. And that the model tends to be imposed on other relationships, like teachers or peers, right? So think about that. So by the time the child's 4 or 5, they've kind of made this early attachment relationship has kind of built this model of what relationship is, and then when they go out into the world and experience other people, they kind of try out that model in like a Piaget scheme, accommodation, assimilation kind of, if you're familiar with that language, way of like interacting with the world, that they're basically taking a model and testing it, and they're like, okay, well, I've learned that I can trust until I'm shown that I can't, or I've learned that everybody's a threat and I can't trust. And obviously those are kind of two extremes, and then there's everything in the middle. But this idea that's important is that this model develops, and then that model is then imposed, which is just another way of saying that early relationship shapes how relationship is understood and how relationship is engaged by that child moving forward in future relationships. That's what people say if they're like, oh, this person has a trust issue. They're literally tying it all the way back to infancy and saying they didn't successfully develop trust, and that's being imposed in this adult manifestation. Like whether they know that that's what they mean or not, that would be what Erickson would have meant when he talked about a trust issue, or about the potential long-term impacts of mistrust, of a dilemma at that stage. right, of a failure to establish trust, because that was his big idea. Okay, so I've already talked about that. I don't have to go back to that. Next slide. Now, you don't have to write this or the next slide down, but I want to just kind of go through this quick because I think you might find this really interesting. But again, I'm not going to test you on this, but I want you to just at least know this. It's kind of interesting to think, like, if these attachment scores didn't, or these attachment classifications didn't tell us anything about future behavior, it'd be a lot less interesting to spend time trying to understand them. What's interesting is looking at what some of the long-term consequences of these early attachment qualities are, right? So let's just look at this for a sec. Children rated as securely attached to their mothers in infancy. So if you were to do a test on a whole bunch of kids and you score a bunch of them as attached, or as securely attached, and then later, when they're a bit older, you look at them, or you do like a longitudinal study, meaning like then you'd like survey them again when they're older, and you look at is there any relationship to these attachment scores actually predict things. What we tend to see is that those kids that scored as securely attached are more sociable, right? So more skilled socially, more positive in their behavior towards friends and towards siblings. We see that they're less clingy, they're less dependent on teachers, they're less aggressive and disruptive. So again, this is all just a lot of pro-social behavior. They're more empathic, more empathetic, I meant to say, more emotionally mature in their interactions in school and in other settings outside the home. The influence of this attachment carries into adulthood, or adolescence and adulthood. Again, you don't have to have this down, but just to expose you to this, that like we see more social skills in the early years, but we also see that these kids start to be more likely to be leaders, more likely to have high self-esteem. We see increased sociability, right? So it seems like this emotional intelligence, or this social ability to form high quality relationships and kind of navigate a complex social world, seems to be higher in these kids that scored as securely attached as infants. Right? It seems to actually affect how they parent. So now think about that. Now, that's not maybe super groundbreaking to think about or to say, or shocking, that like how you're parented affects how you parent. But actually, it's not just that. It's the quality of your attachment relationship affects how you parent, which is kind of a more nuanced and interesting point. And it demonstrates that this attachment relationship, so I don't know why, sorry, maybe if you're making this, don't put that as 6, just make that as like kind of a final point, because it's not really point 6, it's more just like a summary point, that attachment relationships become the foundation of future relationships. It's hard to get around that. In developmental psychology, that's one of the main ideas. Right now, again, it's so nuanced and complex. But this is basically this idea that early experiences have an effect on establishing our model of what relationship and emotion, and establishing our kind of social sense of who we are, and that has an effect on how we process our relationships that come after that. It's core to what we mean by a developing mind. Okay, I'm going to just put this up. So if you're taking notes, you can write it. I can see the camera's covering the one word at the bottom. That's the word. There's just planning, like goals, planning. Okay, so I'm going to read you something. Attachment does not emerge suddenly, but rather develops in a series of phases, moving from a baby's general preferences for human figures to partnership with primary caregivers. Let me just read that again because I kind of mess it up. Attachment does not emerge suddenly, but rather develops in a series of phases, moving from a baby's general preferences for human figures to a partnership with primary caregivers. Following are 4 such phases based on Bowlby's conceptualization of attachment. So this is from Bowlby's original, remember Bowlby and Ainsworth, their work, their conceptualization of attachment, and then a researcher named Schaefer in 1996 created these 4 phases based on that idea. So it's like an extension of the idea. Okay, so the first phase, birth to 2 months. Infants instinctively direct their attachment to human figures. Strangers, siblings, and parents are equally likely to elicit smiling or crying from the infant. Phase 2, from 2 to 7 months, attachment becomes focused on one figure, usually the primary caregiver, as the baby gradually learns to distinguish between familiar and unfamiliar people. Phase 3, from 7 months to 24 months, specific attachments develop. With increased locomotion skill, locomotor, not locomotive, sorry, not like a train. Locomotor just meaning like ability to move. So the kid can start to move, so they can start to like, oh, I want to be with mom more, I'll follow mom. That's what this means. Children become, with increased locomotor skill, babies actively seek contact with regular caregivers such as the mother or father. Phase 4, from 24 months, so 2 years on. Children become aware of other people's feelings, goals, and plans, and begin to take them into account when directing their own actions. I'm just going to read a bit more here. I'll set it down so I'm not rocking so much. Bowlby argued that infants develop an internal working model of attachment. We've been talking about this. A simple mental model of the caregiver, the relationship to this person, and the self and the deserving of nurture and care. Let me just say that again. They develop this internal working model, and that model includes their understanding of that attachment relationship, their understanding of who their caregiver is. So these are all kind of like you can almost view this as a list. Their understanding of their relationship to that caregiver, their understanding of who they think they are, as like who the baby thinks it is, or the infant, and if they think that they're deserving of care. Right? So like how they value themselves is starting to become influenced by this, or is influenced by this. The infant's internal working model of attachment with the caregiver's influences the infant, and later the child's subsequent responses to other people. Sorry, I messed that up. I'm going to just read that again. I'm not going to do that with every sentence in this, but let me just read that again. The infant's internal working model of attachment with the caregiver influences the infant's later responses to other people. The internal model of attachment has also played a pivotal role in the discovery of the links between attachment and subsequent emotional understanding, conscious development, and this idea of self-concept. In an extensive longitudinal study, early secure attachment was linked with positive emotional health, high self-esteem, self-confidence, social competency, in interaction with peers, teachers, camp counselors, and romantic partners in adolescence. Also, a meta-analysis found that secure attachment in infancy is linked to social competence with peers in childhood. Another study revealed that infant attachment insecurity, especially insecure resistant attachment, and early childhood inhibition predicted adolescent social anxiety symptoms. So it's a fascinating topic, really. A few studies have assessed infant attachment security to the mother and father separately, so that's interesting. A lot of the research is on biological mom. So even though I've been saying that, and now this is changing, obviously, a lot of the at least foundational research was assuming biological mom. Now, all those other variables would be interesting to look at. So let me just read this last point. Few studies have assessed the infant's attachment security to the mother and father separately. However, a study by Kosasanik and Kim in 2013 revealed that infants who are insecurely attached to their mother and father, so if they're insecurely attached to both mom and dad, that's called, in quotes here, double insecure at 15 months. So kids that were considered double insecure at 15 months had more externalizing problems, like what we would consider like temper tantrums, out of control behavior, in the elementary school years than their counterparts who were securely attached to at least one parent. So that's interesting. So kids that scored as having an insecure attachment with either parent, so they didn't have a secure attachment at all, had more behavioral problems than a kid if that kid had even one secure attachment. Interesting. I hope that you find this topic interesting. Okay, next slide. This was a long slide. Next slide. So now, okay, so I hope you find this interesting. So now we're talking about how the social orientation. So now the child's like starting to understand that not only they exist, that they exist in the social world, that and how they kind of, now they're trying to make sense of it. So orientation and understanding, trying to make sense of what's going on here, that the mobile infant is beginning to explore and expand their social world as the child's starting to be able to move, right? So this is, again, this link between locomotor, or like local obviously is the word of kind of location, and then the word of like motor, meaning like being able, like motor movements. It's this idea of being able to actually move, being able to crawl, be able to stand up, sit up, roll over. That is actually, there's a lot of interesting stuff about that how like the kids starting to use their hands and build blocks is actually like associated with cognitive skill development, and that actually the cognitive development and the kind of what we would call sensory motor, or like locomotor play and engagement is critical to development of cognitive function. That these locomotor and cognitive skills influence and are influenced by social relationships, right? So this exists, all that kind of thing I just talked about exists within a social environment. That by approximately 8 months old, we see that these infants starting to show interest in each other, right? So they start to notice this interaction with other infants starts to increase by later in the second year. By 18 months to 2 years, we start to have kids. So basically by like 1.5 years to 2 years old, kids start to show this huge increase in how much they're able to do this like imitative play. So I remember really seeing that with my daughter, like the ability to play with other kids and kind of join in their mental world and do this kind of, we called it like joint attention or whatever, parallel play, but basically just this idea of like being able to take turns and be engaged in this thing of just not just sitting beside someone on the floor and both playing with your own toy, but actually being engaged in this like back and forth reciprocal play or imitative play. Like you be the dragon and I'll be the knight, and it's like that would be imitative play, right? We start to see like this, and what I'm saying here is this different, more evolved style of play is actually indicative of cognitive development. It's a sign of intelligence. Okay, so again, I'll just throw these all up here so that you're taking, if you're taking notes. So it says at this bottom line, attention to objects of their interest, just because my camera's covering it a bit. So I'm just going to kind of show you, I'll leave it up here now. I want to read this. The ability to perceive people as engaging in intentional and goal-directed behavior is an important social cognitive accomplishment, and this initially occurs towards the end of the first year. Joint attention, so remember we talked about joint attention, like if I'm like, hey, come here, look at this, and I'm showing you something on a map, and we're both focusing on something, and I'm like, okay, come up here, and then you turn here, and we're both like kind of paying attention to the same thing at the same time. That's joint attention. Gaze following would be like gaze, like G-A-Z-E. So it's like, hey, look at this, and you seeing what I'm looking at and you looking at it, so us paying attention and looking at the same thing. So those two things. Joint attention and gaze following help the infant understand that other people have intentions, right? So the kid starts to see that I'm looking at something, and they start to care about what I'm looking at. They can start to see I have intentions. The ability to link intentions with emotional expressions develops during the second year of life. Understanding of others' intentions and goals improves significantly during the second year of life. Infants react differently to adults who display expected versus unusual emotional responses to events. Let me say that again. So it's like infants respond differently to adults that respond how they think that adults should respond in a situation. And if adults respond in unusual situations, infants notice that, and that makes sense if we're thinking that they're applying a model. It's like, oh, that didn't predict that situation. Of course, infants have goals, and by their first birthday, they begin to direct the caregiver's attention to objects that capture their interest, right? Like, by the time my daughter started to get close to a year, it's really hard to think of like when she was a year versus when she was like a year and a half or whatever. But she started to get more like pointy at things, and she was doing stuff like that way before she was talking. So again, they start to be able to show more intention. They're doing things that they want. They're more goal oriented. They're trying to work towards something, and they're like, starting to be like, I like that toy almost. They're not saying it, but they're like pointing at it, right? Or even like another example of this would be, I don't know if it was a year, but not much longer after that, we started teaching her some basic sign language, like this meant all done, or like this meant more. I think like this was water. It's like there's just like a few, right? And it was this idea of she could understand that before she could say it. You start to see this example of intentional behavior, intentional goal-directed behavior, and this increased ability for cooperation and joint attention. It's like this key reflection of this kid getting smarter. I know I'm getting close to 3 hours. I'm going to wrap this up. We're almost there. The Van Ryzen and colleagues 2011 study. So I'm gonna read about this idea of a developmental cascade. Let me just put this up for you. Okay. The Van Ryzen and colleagues 2011 study reflects a developmental cascade model, which involves this idea that there's these connections across domains of time that influence developmental pathways and outcomes. Right? That we need to understand that it's like, so a cascade means like, I just use this image of like a cascading waterfall, but it just kind of means steps. The word cascade means like kind of steps. Right, so developmental cascades can include the connection between a wide range of biological, cognitive, and social emotional processes, such as attachment, and can also involve social context, such as like just the unique variables about our families, our peers, our school situation, our culture. Further links can produce a positive or a negative outcome at different points in development, such as infancy, early childhood, middle and late childhood, adolescence, adulthood. A meta-analysis, I don't know if you know, but you probably know, but a meta-analysis just means, so say a meta-analysis on the effectiveness of a certain treatment for heart disease would be looking at, instead of being a study, it's actually like a study of studies. So it's looking at a whole bunch. So instead of doing like your own research on whether some treatment helps, say like some kind of medication or something helps with heart disease, it's like a study of all the studies that have looked at that. Call it a meta-analysis. You might have already known that, and I didn't need to say that, but it's an interesting term, and it's an interesting thing because it's a way to look at a whole kind of field of research. They're important, an important piece of it. But anyways, so like for example, this is a meta-analysis of 127 research reports related to this, made the following conclusions: that there's a moderate stability of attachment security that occurs from infancy all the way to adulthood. Number 2, no significant stability occurred from time intervals of more than 15 years. So that's interesting. So it's like in infancy seems to be kind of predictive of teen years, but a lot less predictive of like late adulthood. But then teen years are also predictive of, there's patterns, right? But things can change. So the suggestiveness of what the person will be like later loses power almost with time.
is sort of kind of what that's suggesting, right? So the two first points, because this is kind of interesting, I want to kind of highlight this. Number one, again, that moderate stability of attachment security occurs from early infancy to adulthood. Number two, however, that no significant stability occurs for time limits of over 15 years. Number three, attachment stability was greater when the time span was less than 2 years than it was when it was more than 5. So that's just saying again that this attachment stuff is the power of the effect. If we were to score you now as a child as like securely attached, it's like how long that is predictive sort of behavior loses power over time. Securely attached, number four, securely attached children are at risk. We're less likely to maintain attachment security, while insecurely attached children at risk were likely to continue to be insecurely attached. So, yeah, securely attached children at risk were less likely to maintain attachment security, while insecurely attached children were likely to continue to be insecurely attached. So it's, I know that's a mouthful, but what that's really just saying is like the tendency is to, when situations break down, there's a tendency to move away from secure attachments, not towards them. Right? So yeah, it's a interesting, deep layered conversation about all this, but it's pretty clear that there's something here. It's not predicting things. People have a huge ability to change the directionality of their life, but to say that it has no effect would also be wrong. So social context. Let's talk a little bit about the situation that the infant is in. You know, and again, there's such a diverse types of situations, but the infant's in this family, this new constellation within the family. I like this term. There's like a constellation of subsystems. It's like this idea that there's like, it's not just the child's relationship with the mom, it's also the child's relationship with the dad and the mom's relationship with the dad. And if there's more siblings, there's even more kind of branches of dynamics. That a family is a constellation of subsystems. Like within that like relationship of my family, it's like there's the mother-daughter, there's father-daughter, and then there's husband-wife, right? So there's, I guess, 3 subsystems. So there's this complex whole made out of these interrelated, interacting parts, that each family member participates in several subsystems, right? There's the marital relationship, there's the child behavior and the development, there's like the whole interaction of this kind of intentional parenting. That parenting causes a disequilibrium. That's the scientific way to say that it like totally changes your life way more than getting married. That it's adapted to maintain strong attachment in infant, spouse, friends, and careers. So this idea of like, I'm just going to talk a little bit about this idea of the effect of parenting and how it relates to all these things like attachment to the infant, and how it relates to things like spouses and friends and careers, right? The social context. Because remember, we're talking about both sides of this attachment relationship. So now we're going to talk about just the parents for a bit before I come to an end. And I'm going to make it snappy. I know I'm closing in on 3 hours, so I'll finish this up. So let me just expose you to this idea. So this is this idea of reciprocal socialization, and it's the idea that it's a kind of complex way of looking at this relationship, that maybe it's not just parents socializing their kids, that the kids actually are socializing the parents too. Some couples claim that the baby both brought them closer together and moved them farther apart, and I think it's just this idea that like it's just another challenge. It's like there's interesting studies showing that people tend to rate their marriage lower after a baby's been born, but rate their marriage satisfaction, I should say, lower, and rate their life satisfaction higher.
And it's part of it is because of the added levels of complexity and nuance and chores and all that kind of, and tasks, and developing patterns of handling that. But it also has this incredible ability to bring people closer together. That being parents enhanced, people report that being parents enhanced their sense of themselves and gave them a new, more stable identity as a family or as a couple, or even as, like, for me, like as a father. This idea that it's like, it's not just me that's shaping my daughter is shaping me. It's like, that to me is like the most obvious comment in the world. It's like, I don't know if any single human being I've interacted with in my life has shaped me more than my daughter. It's like, so anyways, this bidirectional socialization, right? So that this socialization is going in both directions. If we were to draw it, you'd draw it like the parent and the kid, and you'd make an arrow with the pointy parts on both sides. The children socialize parents just as parents socialize children. This is a kind of embarrassing picture of me that I'm instantly regretting including in this presentation, but it's a kind of cute picture of Evie. This is at like the butterfly conservatory or whatever it's called, kind of near where I live. But I want to make this point of like, so again, I understand how this sounds kind of sexist, and I think that like there's interesting discussions we could have around this, very fascinating discussions we could have around this if this was in person. I think that, and I have had with students and classes a lot, I think it's interesting though to think that regardless of what people think about it, when we look at in developmental psychology, it's not asking people what they think, it's observing thousands and thousands and thousands of people behaving in certain ways and trying to look for patterns and seeing that there does seem to be parental and maternal differences. Paternal and maternal differences, I meant to say. Right, so like that parents' time interactions so that infants experience turn taking with the parents, and it's like, again, it's creating this scaffolding. Let me just read this quick. An important form of reciprocal socialization is this idea of scaffolding, in which parents time interactions so that their infant experiences turn taking with the parents. So like I can just give the example of like we do that all the time. Like Evie will come home from school, and I'll usually bring Evie to school in the morning. Me and my wife both work from home now in this new like reality of she's on Zoom a lot, and I'm on Zoom a lot with my college classes Monday to Wednesday, and then I interact a lot with them, just not live the other days, and then do this stuff too. But it's this idea of like, so I'll often take her to school in the morning, and then we work here, and then my wife will pick her up and she comes home, and then I'll like sometimes go to the park with her or something, and then she'll play with my wife for a while, and then we'll like have dinner, and then so there's kind of like, and then she'll come down here and we'll like hang out down here or watch a movie, and I'll do work, or we'll just hang out together or play or whatever, and then she'll like, my wife will read a story here. It's like there's kind of like these like patterns that maternal interactions often are centered more around child care activities, that paternal interactions are more around things like rough and tumble play. It's like, I would have to say that within this household, it does sort of follow that within a slight amount in terms of a general tendency. Again, these are like broad stroke generalizations, and there's a lot of exceptions, but there does seem to be a difference in interactional patterns. And that has, and I said earlier in this class, like those differences in patterns have different effects on the child, and they both have different benefits and are important. And yeah, I just addressed the complexity of that a little bit earlier. Okay, so just a few more things to touch on here. So all we have left is a super quick review. I'll do this fast because you've been listening for a long time. We're going to get under to 3 hours for sure here. Okay, so just 8 key points to remember about today. Let's fire through these. Point number 1. Here we go, number 1. Emotion is feeling or affect that occurs when a person is in a state or interaction that is important to them. Infants display a number of emotions early in their development, such as crying, smiling, and showing fear. 2 fears that infants develop are stranger anxiety and a fear of being separated from their caregiver, sometimes called separation anxiety, although this textbook doesn't call it that. You'll sometimes see that called separation anxiety. As infants develop, it's important for them to increase their ability to regulate their emotion. We call that self-regulation. Number 2, temperament is an individual's behavioral style and characteristic way of responding emotionally. Chess and Thomas classify infants as easy, difficult, or slow to warm. Kagan proposed that inhibition to the unfamiliar is an important temperament category. Rothbard and Bates emphasized that effortful control, what we called self-regulation, is an important temperament dimension. Goodness of fit can be an important aspect of a child's adjustment. Number 3, Erikson argued that an infant's first years are characterized by the development of trust versus mistrust. Independence becomes a central theme in the second year of life. My camera's kind of covering it, but it's the stage of autonomy versus shame and guilt. Right? So the infant's kind of at the start of the stage is kind of development of trust, and then the second stage in Erikson's model is development of autonomy. The strange situation, which we had the video of that just a little bit earlier, is a useful tool for examining attachment. Infants differ in how they react to their caregiver leaving and then re-entering the room. And it's an interesting for explanatory and demonstrative value. Infants show a strong interest in the social world and are motivated to understand it. Infants are socially sophisticated and insightful at an earlier age than previously thought. Right, so the social world of infants is more dynamic than we originally thought. Attachment is a close emotional bond between two people. In infancy, contact, comfort, and trust are important in the development of attachment. Securely attached babies use the caregiver, usually the mother, as a secure base from which to explore their environment. Three types of insecure attachments are avoidant, resistant, sometimes called ambivalent, and disorganized. Caregivers of securely attached babies are more sensitive to the baby's signals. We called that contingent responsiveness, and are consistently available to meet their needs. We called that emotional availability. Last 2 points, let's do it. Number 7, the transition to parenthood requires considerable adaptation and adjustment on the part of parents. Yep, children socialize parents just as parents socialize children. Parents use a wide range of methods to manage and guide an infant's behavior. In general, mothers spend more time in caregiving than fathers do. Fathers tend to engage in more physical, playful interactions with infants than mothers do when we observe behavioral patterns. Number 8, the quality of child care is uneven. Right, it's the most obvious statement in the world, but obviously parents are different. The child care remains a controversial topic. Quality child care can be achieved in many may provide many benefits, especially for children in situations where they might not have in lower social economic status homes. So in situations where, especially if it's a situation where there's only one parent, sometimes having additional, what this is basically saying is having additional community level resources can have a huge effect on the quality of childcare in like a community. Right? It's kind of like an argument for community supports, which is what I'm assuming a lot of you are interested in getting involved in, right? So like there's a huge developmental quality to the community in doing that kind of stuff. I love teaching this class.
I hope you have a great weekend and week, and keep taking care of yourself and being awesome. Cheers.